In the deepest hours of night, when shadows lengthen and the world grows still, there comes a tale of fear that dwelt within the heart of darkness itself. For even Sauron the Mighty, the Dark Lord of Mordor, knew the cold touch of dread when he turned his terrible gaze upon one mortal man. This was no ordinary fear, born of sudden peril or unexpected strength, but something far more profound and ancient, rooted in the very foundations of Middle-earth and the long memory of kings. The story begins not with Aragorn himself, but in the mists of the elder days, when the world was young and the light of the two trees still blessed Valinor. In those distant years, when elves walked beneath stars that knew no sun or moon, there came into being the bloodline that would one day make the Dark Lord tremble. For Elros tar Miniatur, the first king of Númenor, carried within his veins both the nobility of elves and the courage of men, and from his line would spring a dynasty that would endure through all the turnings of the world. Númenor rose like a star upon the western waters, an island kingdom blessed by the Valar themselves, where men grew tall and fair and wise, beyond the measure of their kindred in Middle-earth. The kings of that blessed isle ruled with justice and wisdom, their ships sailing to the furthest shores, their influence spreading like dawn across the waters. Yet even in those golden days, Sauron watched and waited, for he understood what others could not see clearly, that in the line of Elros lay a power that could challenge his dominion. The Dark Lord's fear was not born of sword or sorcery, though both would play their part in the tale to come. Rather, it sprang from something far more dangerous to his designs, something that struck at the very heart of his being. For Sauron was, at his core, a creature of lies and deception, one who ruled through fear and corruption, who sought always to bend others to his will through darkness and despair. But in the blood of Númenor's kings flowed something he could neither corrupt nor command, a light that had been kindled in the music of creation itself. This was the light of true kingship, not mere dominion over others, but the sacred bond between ruler and realm that the Valar had woven into the very fabric of Arda. It was a power that called forth loyalty, not through fear, but through love, that inspired hope in the darkest hours, that could unite the scattered and give strength to the weak. Against such light, all the malice of Mordor seemed but shadow, and this Sauron knew with a certainty that chilled his spirit. When Númenor fell beneath the waves, swallowed by the wrath of Eru Ilúvatar for the folly of its last king, Sauron rejoiced, believing that the line of Elros had perished with that drowned kingdom. Yet even in his triumph, seeds of future fear were sown, for Elendil the Tall and his sons had escaped the ruin, carrying with them not only the blood of kings, but the very symbols of their authority. The Palantir, the seeing stones of Númenor, came with them to Middle-earth, and with them too came Narsil, the sword that would one day be reforged to cut the ring from Sauron's hand. In the early years of the Third Age, when the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor stood strong and proud, Sauron's fear seemed almost forgotten, buried beneath his confidence in his own growing power. Yet always it lingered, a shadow at the edge of his consciousness, for he could sense the presence of the Dúnedain, the rangers of the north, keeping their ancient watch. They seemed few and powerless, these weathered wanderers in grey cloaks, yet in their veins flowed still the blood that he had learned to dread. The centuries passed like waves upon a distant shore, and the kingdoms of men grew weak and divided. Arna fell into ruin, its people scattered, its king's line seemingly lost in the wilderness. Gondor endured but grew pale, ruled by stewards while its throne stood empty, waiting for a king who might never come. To mortalize, it seemed that the royal line of Elendil had faded into legend, become merely a tale told by the fireside on winter nights. But Sauron's sight was keener than that of mortals, and his memory longer. Even when the Dark Lord lay dormant in Dol Guldur, even when he seemed naught but a shadow and a whisper, he watched for signs of the blood he feared. The Nazgûl, his most terrible servants, rode forth not merely to spread terror, but to seek always for traces of that ancient lineage. For Sauron understood what few others grasped, that blood and kingship were not mere matters of genealogy, but threads woven into the pattern of fate itself. In the wild lands beyond the misty mountains, where few dared to travel and fewer still to dwell, the chieftains of the Dúnedain kept their vigil. Generation after generation, they guarded the northern lands, protecting villages that knew not their names, fighting evils that left no mark in the histories of the great kingdoms. They carried ancient swords and bore names that echoed with the music of Númenor. Yet to most who glimpsed them, they seemed no more than rough woodsmen, hunters and wanderers of no particular account. Yet in the year 2931 of the Third Age, when winter winds howled across the Etten moors, and darkness seemed to press close upon all the lands of Middle-earth, a child was born who would make even the foundations of Barad-dûr tremble. Arathorn, son of Arador, welcomed into the world a son whom he named Aragorn. And though the babe seemed small and frail in his father's arms, there stirred within him the full measure of his inheritance. The blood of Isildur flowed in his veins, undiluted by the passing years, carrying with it all the power and peril that such lineage entailed. The boy grew in the hidden valley of Rivendell, fostered by Elrond half-elven, who alone among the wise could fully comprehend what manner of king was taking shape beneath his roof. In those peaceful halls, surrounded by the lore and wisdom of ages, Aragorn learned not merely the arts of war and woodcraft, though these he mastered beyond measure, but something far more precious and dangerous. He learned what it meant to be a king, not in name alone, but in the deepest truth of his being. For Elrond taught him the history of his people, the glory and the sorrow of Númenor, the burden and the blessing of the blood that flowed within him. He learned of Gil-galad, the elven king, and Elendil, his ancestor, who had stood together upon the slopes of Mount Doom and struck down Sauron in the hour of his seeming triumph. He learned of Isildur's failure and the curse that lay upon his line, the burden of an oath unfulfilled and a task left undone. Most importantly, he learned that kingship was not a prize to be grasped, but a sacrifice to be embraced, a laying down of self in service to something greater. As the years passed and Aragorn grew from boy to man, ranging ever wider through the wild lands of Eriador, a change began to stir in the darkness of Mordor. Sauron, returned now to his ancient fortress of Barad-dûr, felt a growing unease, a sense that something long dormant was awakening in the world. His servants brought him word of a ranger who moved like shadow through the northern wastes, whose sword never missed its mark, whose presence seemed to kindle hope in the hearts of simple folk. The reports were fragmentary, uncertain, yet they carried with them an echo of something the Dark Lord had hoped never to hear again. It was not the man's skill in battle that troubled Sauron, though Aragorn's prowess with blade and bow grew legendary among those who knew of such things. Nor was it his knowledge of the wild places, though he could track an orc through stone and read the wind like a written page. What sent cold fear creeping through the Dark Lord's spirit was something far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. The way that hope seemed to follow in the ranger's footsteps, like dawn following night. For wherever Aragorn walked, the darkness seemed somehow less complete. Farmers who had cowered behind barred doors found courage to tend their fields. Travellers who had feared to venture beyond sight of their villages began once more to walk the ancient roads. Children who had known only stories of terror began to hear tales of heroes who stood against the dark. It was as though some light that had long been hidden was beginning to shine forth, calling to answering lights in the hearts of all who yearned for something better than mere survival. This was the true source of Sauron's fear, not any weapon that Aragorn might wield, but the kingship that dwelt within him like a flame that could not be quenched. For the Dark Lord understood, as few others did, that true authority came not from force or fear, but from something far deeper and more enduring. A king in the truest sense was one who could call forth the best in others, who could unite the divided and give strength to the weak, who could kindle hope even in the darkest hour. Against such power, all the armies of Mordor were but smoke and shadow. The fear grew stronger as the years passed, fed by reports that reached the Dark Tower through many channels. The mouth of Sauron brought word of a ranger who had walked in Gondor, who had looked upon the paths of the dead with eyes that showed no fear. The Nazgul whispered of one who bore himself like a king, though he claimed no throne, whose very presence seemed to diminish their power. From Isengard came darker tidings still, for Saruman the White had taken note of this Aragorn's son of Arathorn, and in his words, Sauron heard an echo of his own growing dread. The wizard's reports spoke of encounters that left even Saruman unsettled, moments when the ranger's gaze had seemed to pierce through all pretense and deception to see the truth beneath. There had been a meeting in the wild lands east of the Misty Mountains, where Saruman had tested this descendant of kings with riddles and half-truths, seeking to measure the depth of his knowledge and the strength of his will. But it was the wizard who had come away shaken, for in Aragorn's quiet responses, he had heard not the desperate bravado of a pretender, but the measured wisdom of one who had long carried burdens too heavy for lesser men. The ranger had spoken of the ancient oaths as though he had been present when they were sworn, had named the kings of old as though they were uncles and grandfathers rather than figures from distant legend. Most troubling of all, he had looked upon Saruman without awe or fear, but with something that might almost have been pity, as though he could see the corruption that was even then beginning to eat away at the White Wizard's heart. These were the shadows that gathered around Sauron's thoughts as the Third Age drew toward its close, the growing certainty that somewhere in the wild places of Middle-earth walked one who might yet prove his undoing, not through strength of arms alone, though the blood of Númenor ran strong in Aragorn's veins, but through that more ancient and terrible power that had once driven back the darkness in the elder days. It was the power that had moved Gil-galad and Elendil to stand before the Black Gate, that had given Isildur the strength to cut the ring from Sauron's hand. It was the light of the two trees that still burned, however dimly, in the hearts of those who remembered what the world had been before the shadow fell upon it. The Dark Lord's spies brought word of other troubling signs as well. In Rivendell, the elves spoke of the Ranger with a respect they had shown to few mortals since the fall of Númenor. Elrond himself had taken the man into his councils, had shared with him lore that was kept from all but the most trusted. The Lord of Imladris had looked upon Aragorn and seen not merely another descendant of the ancient line, but one in whom the nobility of his forefathers burned bright and clear. There were whispers, too, of Arwen Undomiel, fairest of the Eldar in Middle-earth, and how her heart had turned toward this mortal man with a love that echoed the great romances of the elder days. Such a union would bind the fates of elves and men more closely than they had been bound since the time of Elendil, would create ties that even the ending of the world might not sever. From the Golden Wood came reports that filled Sauron with an even deeper unease. Galadriel the Wise, she who had refused the ring when it was offered freely to her, had looked upon Aragorn with eyes that had seen the light of Valinor, and she had named him king. Not king to be or rightful heir, but king in truth, as though the crown already rested upon his brow, though he walked still in the wild places far from any throne. The Lady of Lorien had spoken words that reached Sauron's ears through channels he preferred not to contemplate. Prophecies that spoke of the return of the king and the renewal of all things. She had seen in her mirror visions of what was to come, glimpses of a future where the white tree bloomed again in Minas Tirith, and the reunited kingdom stretched from the sea to the borders of Mordor itself. But perhaps most troubling of all were the signs that spoke not of what others saw in Aragorn, but of what he was becoming in himself. The rangers who rode with him reported changes that grew more marked with each passing season. The quiet authority that had always been his was deepening into something that reminded the oldest among them of tales their grandfathers had told of the kings of old. When he spoke now of the ancient laws and customs, it was not as a scholar reciting learned texts, but as one who carried the living memory of his people within his heart. The sword that he bore, reforged from the shards of Narsil, seemed to grow brighter in his hand with each battle fought against the servants of darkness. Anduril, Flame of the West, had become more than a weapon in Aragorn's grasp. It was a symbol of hope renewed, a sign that the line of kings had not failed and would not fail, while courage remained in the hearts of free folk. The Dark Lord found himself remembering other times when such signs had appeared, other ages when the light had seemed to grow stronger just as the darkness reached its greatest depth. He remembered the awakening of the elves beneath the stars, and how their songs had first challenged his master's dominion over Middle-earth. He recalled the coming of the Edain to Beleriand, and how their brief flames had burned so bright that even Morgoth had been forced to take notice. Most painful of all, he remembered the alliance of Gil-galad and Elendil, and how their combined might had brought low the greatest power that had ever walked in Middle-earth since the music began. Now, in this descendant of Elendil, he sensed the stirring of that same terrible potential, the possibility that once again the free peoples might find in themselves the strength to stand against the shadow. The fear that gnawed at Sauron's spirit was not the simple dread of defeat in battle, for he had known defeat before, and had always found ways to return stronger than before. What he feared was something far more fundamental, the possibility that Aragorn might succeed in doing what no enemy had ever accomplished, not merely defeating the Dark Lord's armies or destroying his physical form, but actually undoing the corruption that he had spent millennia spreading throughout Middle-earth. A true king, Sauron knew, was more than a warrior or a ruler. A true king was a healer, one who could call forth the best in his people and restore what had been broken. Against such power, all the malice and cunning of the Dark Lord might prove as nothing more than morning mist before the rising sun. And so, as the years passed and the final confrontation drew ever nearer, Sauron found his thoughts turning again and again to this ranger who walked in the wild places, this heir of kings who claimed no crown but carried kingship in his very bones. In the depths of the Dark Tower, surrounded by all the engines of war and destruction that his malice had devised, the Dark Lord of Mordor knew a fear that cut deeper than any blade, the fear that somewhere in the darkness a light was growing that would prove stronger than all his shadow, and that the name of that light was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Isildur's heir, the king that was promised to return. The weight of this knowledge pressed upon Sauron like a stone upon his spirit, for he understood that Aragorn represented something that transcended the mere mechanics of warfare or politics. Here was a man who carried within himself the memory of what Middle-earth had been before the shadow fell upon it, who bore the bloodline of those who had walked with the Valar themselves in the days when the world was young. Through Aragorn flowed the heritage of Númenor in its glory, when the Dúnedain had been tall and fair and wise, when their ships had sailed to the grey havens, bearing gifts of friendship rather than conquest, when their kings had ruled with justice, and their people had lived in peace beneath the light of the two trees, reflected in the waters of the west. This was what Sauron feared above all else. Not the strength of Aragorn's sword arm, though that was considerable, not the loyalty of those who would follow him, though that too was a force to be reckoned with, but the possibility that through this man, the very memory of goodness might be restored to a world that had grown accustomed to darkness. For Sauron's greatest victory had never been in the winning of battles or the conquest of lands, but in the slow corruption of hope itself, in teaching the peoples of Middle-earth to accept that evil was inevitable, that the shadow was eternal, that the light which had once shone so brightly in the elder days was nothing more than a fading dream. Through long ages of patient malice, the Dark Lord had worked to make the world forget what it had once been. He had whispered in the ears of kings that power was its own justification, had planted seeds of discord between peoples who had once stood together, had nurtured the small cruelties and petty fears that grow in mortal hearts until they blossomed into something far more terrible. He had taught men to look upon the elves with envy rather than wonder, had shown them how to see the differences between themselves and the other free peoples as cause for suspicion rather than celebration. Most cunningly of all, he had convinced them that the age of heroes was past, that the time when ordinary folk might stand against the darkness and prevail was nothing more than a tale told by the fireside to comfort children afraid of the night. But in Aragorn, Sauron saw the living refutation of all these carefully planted lies. Here was a man who had spent his life not in the halls of power, but in the wild places, who had learned to see beauty in a flower growing in a crack in the stone, who had found friendship among rangers and elves alike, who carried hope not as a burden, but as a gift freely given. Here was one who remembered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to act rightly despite fear, who understood that true strength lay not in dominating others, but in lifting them up, who knew that a crown was not a prize to be grasped, but a responsibility to be borne. The Dark Lord had seen such men before. In the elder days, when the world was younger and the light burned brighter in the hearts of mortals, he had seen barons stand before the throne of Thingol and speak words that rang with such truth that even the proud elven king had been moved to wonder. He had watched Tuor walk the halls of Gondolin and bring with him tidings that would kindle hope even in the darkest hour of that hidden realm. Most bitter of all, he had witnessed Elendil sail into the uttermost west, bearing upon his brow a light that had been kindled before the making of the world, and return with the hosts of Valinor at his back. In each of these, Sauron had recognized the same quality that now troubled him when he thought of Aragorn: the capacity to inspire others to be more than they believed they could be, to call forth the nobility that lay sleeping in even the humblest heart, to stand as living proof that the darkness, no matter how deep or how long it had endured, was not the final word in the story of Middle-earth. This was the power that the Dark Lord feared above all others, for it was the one power against which his malice had no answer, the one force that could not be corrupted or turned to his purpose. As the War of the Ring drew nearer, Sauron found himself studying every report that came to him from his spies and servants, searching for some sign that Aragorn was merely another ambitious mortal seeking power for its own sake, some indication that the Ranger could be tempted or corrupted, as so many others had been before him. But the more he learned, the deeper his unease grew. Here was a man who had turned away from the throne of Gondor, not once but many times, who had spent decades serving others, with no thought of reward, who had walked the paths of exile and hardship, when he might have claimed a palace and a crown. The Dark Lord recalled how easily other heirs of Númenor had fallen to his whispered temptations. The kings of Númenor itself had been brought low by their desire for immortality and their fear of death. The kings of Gondor had grown proud and distant from their people, more concerned with the glory of their lineage than with the welfare of those they ruled. Even Isildur, the very ancestor whose blood flowed in Aragorn's veins, had been overcome by the desire to possess the ring rather than destroy it when the chance had been given to him. But in all his watching and waiting, Sauron could find no such weakness in Aragorn. The Ranger seemed to carry his heritage not as a source of pride, but as a reminder of responsibility, not as a claim to privilege, but as a call to service. He had learned the healing arts not to gain power over others, but to ease their suffering. He had mastered the ways of war, not to conquer, but to protect. He had studied the lore of his people, not to glorify himself, but to better understand the burden that might one day be his to bear. This was what made Aragorn truly dangerous in the eyes of the Dark Lord. Not his skill with a sword, though that was considerable, not his knowledge of the ancient ways, though that too was formidable, but his fundamental understanding that true kingship was about sacrifice rather than dominion. Such a man could not be bought with promises of power, could not be frightened with threats of destruction. could not be turned from his purpose by any of the weapons that Sauron had used so effectively against others throughout the long ages of his malice. As the final years of the Third Age drew toward their close, the Dark Lord found himself haunted by visions of what might come to pass if Aragorn should indeed claim his throne and prove himself to be the king that the blood of Númenor had promised he might become. He saw the reunited kingdom rising like a light in the darkness, drawing to itself all those who still remembered what Middle-earth had been before the shadow fell upon it. He saw the ancient alliances renewed, elf and dwarf and man standing together once more as they had in the days of the last alliance. He saw the wild places made safe again, the roads opened to peaceful travel, the harbours filled with ships bearing goods and friendship rather than war and conquest. Most terrible of all, he saw the hope kindling once more in the hearts of the free peoples, the growing understanding that the darkness was not eternal, that the light had not been extinguished but only hidden, waiting for the proper moment to blaze forth once more and drive back the shadow that had so long held dominion over the world. And so it was that as the War of the Ring approached its climax, Sauron's attention turned ever more frequently to the figure of Aragorn, watching his every move with the intensity of one who knows that his enemy holds within his grasp the power to undo all that has been so carefully built over long centuries of patient malice. The Dark Lord observed as the ranger emerged from the wild lands where he had spent so many years in humble service, watched as he took up the reforged sword of his fathers and began the long journey toward the destiny that had been written in the stars at his birth. There was something inevitable about it all, something that spoke to the deeper currents of fate, that even Sauron, for all his power and cunning, could not fully control or comprehend. The moment when Aragorn first grasped Andúril, Flame of the West, newly reforged from the shards of Narsil that had lain broken for so many years, was one that sent tremors through the very foundations of Barad-dûr. For this was not merely the restoration of an ancient weapon, but the awakening of a lineage that had slumbered too long, the return of a power that Sauron had hoped was lost forever to the turning of the years. In the remaking of that blade, the smiths of Rivendell had wrought more than steel and fire could account for. They had given form once more to the will of Númenor at its noblest, to the covenant between the Dúnedain and all free peoples of Middle-earth, to the promise that even in the darkest hour, the light of Elendil would not be wholly quenched. When Aragorn bore that sword into the paths of the dead, calling upon the Oathbreakers to fulfill at last their ancient pledge, Sauron felt the stirring of forces that he had thought safely buried beneath the weight of ages. The dead who had betrayed Isildur in life found in his heir the means of their redemption, and in their awakening, the Dark Lord glimpsed something of the justice that runs deeper than his own malice, the turning of the wheel that brings all debts at last to their accounting. Here was kingship as it was meant to be, not the domination of the weak by the strong, but the calling of all souls to their highest purpose, the transformation of failure into triumph through the alchemy of forgiveness and second chances. The very stones of Minas Tirith seemed to sing when Aragorn at last came to the city of his fathers, though he came not as a conqueror demanding submission, but as a healer offering restoration. In the houses of healing, where he tended to those wounded in the great battle, Sauron's sword displayed the kind of power that he had never understood and could never wield, This was not the dominion that comes from fear, but the authority that flows from love, freely given and gratefully received. The hands that could wield a sword with deadly skill were the same hands that could draw the poison from a wound and call the dying back from the threshold of the darkness. Such paradox was beyond the Dark Lord's comprehension, for he had long ago chosen to see strength and gentleness as incompatible, power and mercy as mutually exclusive. In the days that followed the coronation, as Aragorn began the great work of rebuilding that would define his reign, Sauron's spirit, though diminished and scattered, continued to watch with something approaching despair. For here was being wrought the very thing he had laboured so long to prevent, the healing of the wounds that his malice had torn in the fabric of Middle-earth. The new king did not seek to expand his borders through conquest, but worked instead to restore what had been broken, to replant what had been laid waste, to rebuild what had been torn down. The reunited kingdom grew not through the subjugation of its neighbours, but through the patient cultivation of friendship and alliance, through the slow work of proving that strength could serve something greater than itself. The marriage of Aragorn to Arwen and Domiel was perhaps the most bitter blow of all, to whatever remained of Sauron's consciousness in those later days. For in their union was embodied the healing of the ancient grief that had divided the firstborn from the race of men, the bridging of the sundering that had weakened both kindreds through long ages of mistrust and sorrow. Their love was not merely the joining of two hearts, but the weaving together once more of the great themes that had run through the music of creation from the beginning, the harmony that Sauron's discord had sought so long to shatter. In their children would flow the blood of Luthien and Beren, of Elendil and Elwing, of all the great heroes whose deeds had kindled hope in the darkest hours of the elder days. As the years of the Fourth Age began to unfold, the wisdom of Aragorn's kingship became ever more apparent, and with it the full measure of what Sauron had feared and sought to prevent. The roads that had been perilous for so long became safe for merchants and travellers, farmers and pilgrims. The wild places where orcs and wolves had lurked were cleansed and made wholesome again. Trade flourished between the kingdoms of men and the remaining strongholds of the elves, between the Shire and the halls of the dwarves beneath the mountains. Art and learning, music and poetry, all the gentle pursuits that Sauron's malice had sought to crush beneath the weight of fear and war, began to bloom once more like flowers after a long and bitter winter. But perhaps what would have grieved the Dark Lord most, had he possessed the capacity for such understanding, was the way that Aragorn bore the weight of kingship itself. He did not grow proud or distant with the passing years, did not allow the trappings of majesty to separate him from the people he served. He remained always the ranger at heart, ready to take up his sword in defence of the innocent, to walk the wild paths when duty called, to sit by a sickbed through the long watches of the night, if his presence could bring comfort to the suffering. The crown of Gondor rested upon his brow, but it did not change the fundamental truth of who he was: a guardian, a protector, a servant of all that was good and beautiful in Middle-earth. In his final years, when the weight of mortality began at last to tell upon even his long-lived frame, Aragorn faced the approach of death with the same quiet courage that had marked all his days. He did not rage against the fading of his strength, did not seek to cling to power beyond his time, but prepared instead to lay down the burden of kingship as gracefully as he had taken it up. The reunited kingdom that he left behind was not dependent upon his presence for its continued flourishing, for he had built it upon foundations deeper than any single life, upon principles and traditions that would endure long after his own voice was silenced. And so it was that Sauron's greatest fear was realized not in some moment of dramatic conquest, but in the quiet persistence of goodness through all the long years of peace that followed the War of the Ring. Aragorn had proven that power could serve love rather than demanding its submission, that strength could protect rather than destroy, that a king could be great not by elevating himself above his people, but by lifting them up to share in the nobility that was their birthright as children of Ilúvatar. In the end, the Dark Lord's defeat was complete, not merely because his armies were broken and his fortress cast down, but because the very possibility he had most dreaded had come to pass. Middle-earth had remembered what it meant to hope, and in that remembrance, the shadow was banished not by force, but by the simple, inexorable power of light, returning to a world that had waited too long in darkness for the coming of its rightful king. The legacy of Aragorn's reign extended far beyond the borders of Gondor and Arnor, rippling outward like gentle waves across the waters of time to touch every corner of Middle-earth. In the years that followed his passing, the world bore witness to the fulfillment of prophecies that had been whispered in the darkness for generations uncounted. The age of men had truly begun, but it was an age tempered by wisdom, learned through suffering, guided by the memory of what had been nearly lost and the determination never to let such darkness rise again. The rangers of the north, no longer scattered and homeless, took up their ancient duties with renewed purpose, watching over the wild lands with eyes made keen by the knowledge of how precious peace truly was. They walked the old paths that Aragorn himself had trodden in his years of exile, carrying forward his understanding that true nobility lay not in titles or recognition, but in the willingness to stand guard over those who slept safely in their beds, never knowing how close the danger had come to their doors. In the south, the great cities that had once cowered behind their walls began to send forth merchants and craftsmen, scholars and healers, to lands that had been lost to shadow for centuries. The roads that had been broken were rebuilt, not merely as pathways for trade and travel, but as arteries through which the lifeblood of hope could flow to regions that had known only despair. Where once Sauron's influence had spread like a blight, poisoning the very earth with fear and hatred, now there grew gardens and orchards, libraries and halls of learning, places where the light of wisdom could flourish and grow bright once more. The Dark Lord had sought to make all the world a reflection of Mordor, a wasteland where nothing good could take root, but Aragorn's reign had proven that even the most poisoned ground could be cleansed and made fertile again through patience, care, and the gentle persistence of those who refused to accept that any place was beyond redemption. The Elves, who had for so long prepared for their departure from Middle-earth, found in these years a bitter-sweet comfort. They had not fought and suffered in vain, for the world they were leaving behind was one where their efforts had borne fruit beyond their most hopeful dreams. The kingdoms of men were not pale shadows of what had come before, but something new and vital, carrying forward the best of what the elder days had offered, while adding their own unique gifts to the great symphony of creation. When the last ship sailed from the grey havens, Their passengers could look back upon shores where the light of the two trees lived on, not in the Silmarils that had been lost or the rings of power that had fulfilled their purpose, but in the hearts and minds of mortals who had learned to kindle their own flames against the darkness. The dwarves, too, found their ancient halls ringing once more with the sound of hammer upon anvil. But now they worked not merely to accumulate wealth or to delve ever deeper into the bones of the earth, but to create things of beauty and purpose that would serve the growing peace. The treasures they crafted were not hoarded in secret vaults, but given freely to those who had need. For they had learned through bitter experience that the greatest riches were those that were shared. The mountain kingdoms that had once stood in isolation now opened their gates to welcome travelers and traders, scholars and storytellers, all who came in friendship and good faith. The wounds that had divided the free peoples began to heal, not through the forgetting of old grievances, but through the recognition that their strength lay in their unity, their differences a source of richness rather than division. Even the Shire, that most peaceful and protected of realms, felt the gentle influence of these changing times. The hobbits who had played such a crucial role in the great events of the age did not retreat entirely into their old ways of comfortable isolation, but maintained a quiet awareness of the wider world and their place within it. They became the keepers of memory in their own fashion, preserving in their songs and stories the tale of how even the smallest and most unlikely among the free peoples could rise to greatness when the need was dire. Their gardens flourished as never before, not merely because the seasons were kind, but because they tended them with hearts that had been touched by wonder, hands that had learned the true value of simple, honest labor in a world where such virtues had nearly been lost forever. In the years that followed Aragorn's death, when new kings sat upon the throne of Gondor and the direct line of Isildur continued to guide the reunited kingdom, the memory of what Sauron had feared became a living thing, passed down not merely through the chronicles of scholars, but through the daily choices of ordinary people who had learned to recognize the difference between true authority and the mere exercise of power. The kings who followed Aragorn understood that their legitimacy came not from their bloodline alone, but from their willingness to serve as he had served, to see in every subject not a resource to be exploited, but a person deserving of protection and respect. They ruled not through fear or manipulation, but through the patient building of trust, the careful tending of justice, the recognition that a kingdom's true wealth lay not in its gold or its armies, but in the happiness and prosperity of its people. The shadow that Sauron had cast across Middle-earth had been lifted not merely by his defeat in battle, but by the demonstration that his fundamental understanding of power and authority was false. He had believed that might made right, that fear was more reliable than love, that the strong were destined to rule over the weak simply by virtue of their strength. But Aragorn's reign had proven that true power came from service, that lasting authority grew from the willing consent of the governed, that the greatest victories were won not through conquest, but through the patient work of building something better than what had come before. In revealing these truths, the returned king had not merely reclaimed his throne, but had reclaimed the very idea of what kingship could and should be in a world where the darkness had been driven back and the light was free to shine once more. The fear that had gripped Sauron's heart in his final moments the terror of facing an opponent who embodied everything he had sought to destroy, lived on as a reminder of how the world had been transformed. In every act of mercy where cruelty might have been expected, in every choice of cooperation over domination, in every moment when the strong chose to protect rather than exploit the weak, the Dark Lord's deepest nightmare was made manifest anew. Middle-earth had not merely survived his assault upon it, but had emerged stronger and wiser, more beautiful and more hopeful than it had been before the shadow fell. The age that followed was not a pale echo of greater days, but a time of new growth and fresh possibilities, when the lessons learned through suffering could be transformed into wisdom, and wisdom into a legacy that would endure long after the last memory of Mordor had faded into the mists of time. And so the years flowed onward, like a great river returning to its proper course, carrying with them the echoes of that ancient fear that had seized the Dark Lord in his final hour. For in the end, what Sauron had truly dreaded was not merely the return of a rightful king, but the return of hope itself, embodied in flesh and blood, walking the paths of Middle-earth with steady purpose and unwavering resolve. The ranger who had wandered the wild places for so many years, protecting those who knew not his name or his lineage, had become the living proof that nobility was not a birthright to be claimed, but a burden to be carried, not a crown to be worn, but a service to be rendered daily, without fanfare or expectation of reward. In the years that followed Aragorn's coronation, as the new king walked among his people and listened to their concerns with the same patience he had once shown to the whispers of the wind in the wilderness, the very foundations of what Sauron had built his power upon continued to crumble. The Dark Lord had ruled through the cultivation of despair, through the careful nurturing of the belief that the world was a place of inevitable suffering, where the only choice was between being the hammer or the anvil, the predator or the prey. But Aragorn's reign demonstrated day by day that there were other ways to live, other paths to walk, other choices to be made. The king would rise each morning before dawn, as he had done in his ranger days, and walk through the streets of Minas Tirith while the city still slept, observing the quiet rhythms of ordinary life with the same attention he had once paid to tracking orc movements through the wilderness. He saw how the bakers began their work while the stars still shone, how the guards changed shifts with quiet professionalism, how the early merchants prepared their wares with careful pride. In these small, unnoticed acts of daily devotion to craft and duty, he recognized the true strength of his kingdom, the foundation upon which all else must rest. When petitioners came before his throne, seeking justice or mercy, or simply to be heard, Aragorn listened with the same intensity he had once brought to reading the signs written in bent grass and broken twigs along forest paths. He understood that each person who stood before him carried within themselves a story as complex and worthy of attention as any tale of ancient kings or mighty battles. The farmer whose crops had failed, the merchant whose goods had been stolen, the mother whose son had not returned from war, the craftsman whose guild had been cheated by corrupt officials. Each was a thread in the great tapestry of his realm, and each deserved to be woven back into the pattern with care and skill. This approach to kingship, so different from the iron-fisted rule that had characterized the Age of Shadow, began to transform not merely Gondor, but the very understanding of what it meant to wield authority in Middle-earth. the influence spread outward like ripples on a still pond, reaching the courts of other lands, the councils of other peoples. The Rohirrim, already bound to Gondor by ancient oaths and fresh friendship, found in Éomer a king who sought to emulate Aragorn's example, ruling not as a war chief seeking glory, but as a shepherd watching over his people with constant vigilance and care. Even in distant realms, the news of how the returned King of Gondor conducted himself began to change the expectations that people held of their rulers. No longer could a lord or chieftain simply demand obedience by right of birth or strength of arm. The example of Elisar had shown that true authority must be earned anew each day, must be justified not by what one's ancestors had accomplished, but by what one chose to do in the present moment, faced with the needs and hopes of those who look to leadership for guidance and protection. This transformation struck at the very heart of what had made Sauron's power possible in the first place. The Dark Lord had thrived in a world where despair made people willing to accept any authority that promised order, even if that order came at the cost of freedom and dignity. He had built his strength upon the foundation of hopelessness, upon the belief that the world was so broken that even a terrible master was better than no master at all. But Aragorn's reign proved that there could be masters who served rather than enslaved, leaders who lifted up rather than pressed down, authority that grew stronger by empowering others rather than by diminishing them. The fear that had gripped Sauron as he faced this truth in his final moments continued to reverberate through the years that followed, not as a living emotion in a destroyed consciousness, but as a kind of cosmic vindication of everything the Dark Lord had sought to prevent. Every child who grew up in the renewed kingdom, learning to read and write and think for themselves, rather than simply to obey without question, was a small victory over the philosophy that had driven Mordor's war machine. Every farmer who prospered through his own labour, rather than toiling for the enrichment of distant masters, was a refutation of the belief that some were born to rule and others to serve. Every craftsman who took pride in his work rather than fear in his failure was a testament to the possibility of finding joy and meaning in a world that the Shadow had proclaimed to be meaningless and cruel. The rangers who continued to patrol the wild places, now openly acknowledged as the guardians they had always been, carried with them the memory of their former chieftain's example. They protected not because they were commanded to do so, but because they had chosen to make themselves responsible for the safety of those who could not protect themselves. In their quiet vigilance, in their willingness to face danger so that others might sleep peacefully in their beds, the spirit of Aragorn's kingship lived on, multiplied and distributed across the length and breadth of the reunited realm. As the seasons turned and the years accumulated, the very landscape of Middle-earth began to heal from the wounds that the Age of Shadow had inflicted upon it. The dead marshes slowly cleared as the unquiet spirits found peace at last. The brown lands east of the Emyn Muil began to show hints of green as patient gardeners, inspired by the example of the Shire folk who had helped save the world, worked to restore what had been lost. The forests that had retreated before the axes of Saruman and his ilk began to spread their borders once more, as the Ents and their shepherds found that they were no longer alone in their care for the growing things of the world. This renewal was not merely a return to what had been before, but a growing into something new and better, something that incorporated the hard-won wisdom of the age of trial and shadow into a deeper understanding of what it meant to dwell in harmony with the world and with one another. The songs that were sung in the taverns and halls spoke not only of the great deeds of heroes, but of the small kindnesses of neighbours, the patient work of healing, the quiet courage required to build rather than destroy, to nurture rather than exploit, to hope rather than despair. In all of this, the echo of Sauron's fear lived on, transformed now from a dark lord's terror into a bright promise fulfilled. He had feared the return of the king because he had understood, perhaps better than anyone, what such a return would mean for the world he had sought to reshape in his own image. He had known that if even one person could demonstrate that power could be wielded with wisdom and restraint, that authority could serve rather than dominate, that strength could protect rather than oppress, then the entire foundation of his philosophy would be revealed as the lie it had always been. And so it had come to pass, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the slow, patient work of years, as the example of one king inspired others, as the transformation of one realm encouraged the renewal of many, as the hope kindled in one heart spread like dawn, breaking across a long darkened world. The fear that had seized the Dark Lord in his final moments had been justified, for his defeat had not ended merely with his destruction, but with the proof that everything he had believed and taught and enforced through terror and pain was false, that there were indeed other ways to live, other paths to walk, other choices to be made by those who found within themselves the courage to reach for something better than what they had known before. And in the long years that followed, as the fourth age of the sun unfolded, the legacy of Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Elisar Tel-Contar, king of the reunited kingdom, endured not as a mere memory, but as a living, breathing testament to the power of courage, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to justice. His reign was marked by a steady rebuilding, a weaving together of shattered threads, and a careful tending of the lands and peoples entrusted to his care. He did not seek to dominate or to impose his will without consent, but rather to inspire, to guide, and to serve, embodying the very antithesis of the power Sauron had wielded. He ruled for 122 years, a lifespan far beyond that of mortal men of his time, a gift from his Númenorian ancestry, allowing him to oversee the true re-establishment of peace and prosperity. From Minas Tirith, the White City, his wisdom flowed like a clear river, nourishing the lands and the hearts of men. He brought peace to the former lands of Gondor and Arnor, uniting them into a realm of unprecedented strength and harmony. He dealt with the Easterlings, those enduring foes from the East, not always through war, but often through diplomacy and the establishment of clear, well-guarded borders, showing that even ancient animosities could be managed with firm resolve and a desire for lasting peace. His authority was recognized and respected, not because of fear, but because of the justice and prosperity that flourished under his hand. The dwarves from the Iron Hills and the Lonely Mountain found renewed friendship with the kingdom, and trade flourished between them. The Elves, though their time in Middle-earth was drawing to a close, remained for a while in Rivendell and Lothlorien, and their wisdom was often sought by the king, particularly the counsel of his queen, Arwen Undomiel. Their marriage itself was a symbol of the healing of old wounds and the bridging of ancient divides. a union of the Eldar and the Edain, affirming the hope that had been born out of the darkness. Arwen, having chosen a mortal life, walked beside him, her grace and wisdom a comfort and a strength to the king and to the realm. She bore him a son, Eldarion, who was destined to inherit the throne, and several daughters, ensuring the continuation of the royal house of Tel Kontar. Aragorn, with his deep understanding of history and the ways of the world, never forgot the ancient wrongs and the perils that had been overcome. He understood that vigilance was still necessary, even in times of peace. He personally oversaw the establishment of the Rangers of the North once more, but this time not as a hidden, dwindling folk, but as an honoured and vital part of the kingdom's protection, ensuring the safety of the northern lands and the re-establishment of a thriving populace in Arnor. He would often ride out himself, inspecting the borders, speaking with his people, and ensuring that justice was administered fairly throughout his vast dominion. His presence was not just that of a distant monarch, but of a shepherd tending his flock, known and loved by those he ruled. The Shire, dear to his heart, was placed under the protection of the reunited kingdom, its borders respected and its self-governance affirmed. He declared it a free land, forever exempt from the direct rule of men, and no great folk were permitted to enter without leave. The Brandybuck and Took families, elevated by their deeds in the War of the Ring, became councillors and figures of respect within the Shire, guiding its affairs. Samwise Gamgee, in particular, remained a close friend and confidant of the king, often exchanging letters and visits, their bond a testament to the unexpected alliances that had brought about the victory. The story of the hobbits, their unlikely courage, and their love for simple, good things, became a cherished part of the kingdom's lore, a reminder that even the smallest hands could turn the tide of great events. Legolas, the elf of the woodland realm, and Gimli, the dwarf of the lonely mountain, though they eventually journeyed to the Undying Lands, remained in Middle-earth for many years after the war. Their enduring friendship became legendary, a symbol of the breaking of ancient prejudices and the forging of new understanding between their peoples. They travelled widely, often visiting Minas Tirith, and their presence served as a constant reminder of the wider world and the alliances that had been formed in the face of the encroaching shadow. As the years turned into decades, the memory of Sauron and his terror began to recede into the realm of legend for most, a dark tale told by firelight on long winter nights. But for Aragorn, and for those who had borne the brunt of the war, the lessons were indelible. He knew that evil could always resurface in new forms, and that the fight for good was a continuous one, requiring constant effort and a steadfast heart. He understood that the defeat of Sauron was not the end of all struggles, but the beginning of an age where men would largely shape their own destinies, for good or ill. His reign was a golden age, but not one devoid of challenges. The old wounds of the earth took time to heal. The lands that had been blighted by Mordor and the orcs, the mountains scarred by war, all required patient tending. Yet, under his wise rule, the forests grew, the rivers ran clear, and the fields yielded abundant harvests. The arts and sciences flourished, and the knowledge that had been preserved in hidden libraries was brought forth and shared, illuminating the minds of a new generation. In the end, as his final century drew to a close, Aragorn, knowing his time was near, prepared for his passing with the same grace and wisdom that had marked his life. He called his son, Eldarion, to him, and laid down the crown of the reunited kingdom, and the winged crown of Gondor, and the sceptre of Númenor, passing on the heavy mantle of kingship. He spoke to Eldarion of the duties and burdens of kingship, of the responsibility to his people, and of the enduring struggle against darkness, both without and within. He reminded him that true power lay not in domination, but in service, and in fostering the well-being of all. His farewell to Arwen was poignant, filled with both sorrow and a deep, abiding love. She, who had forsaken immortality for him, now faced a future without him, but she had chosen her path with open eyes and a full heart. Their love had been a light in the darkness, a testament to the enduring power of affection and shared destiny. Finally, Aragorn lay down upon his bed in the House of the Kings, and he closed his eyes, passing peacefully from the circles of the world. It was the year 120 of the Fourth Age. His death was mourned deeply throughout the kingdom, but it was not a death without hope. He had completed his long journey, fulfilled his destiny, and left behind a thriving, peaceful realm. His passing marked the true end of the age of heroes and the beginning of the age of men in earnest, an age that he had helped to shape and guide towards a brighter dawn. Arwen, after his passing, felt the full weight of her choice. She journeyed to Lothlorien, which was now largely deserted, its golden trees fading, its light dimming. She grieved for her love, for the world that was passing, and for the choices she had made. She lay down to rest on Caer Amroth, the green hill where she and Aragorn had plighted their troth so long ago, and there she herself passed away, the last star of her people to fade from Middle-earth. Her departure marked the end of the Eldar's long sojourn and the full dominance of mortals in the lands west of the sea. The fear that Sauron had harboured, the profound dread of Aragorn's return, was indeed justified. For Aragorn was not merely a warrior or a king by right of lineage. He was the living embodiment of everything Sauron despised and sought to crush. He represented the free will that Sauron sought to enslave, the compassion that Sauron scorned as weakness, the hope that Sauron yearned to extinguish. His reign proved that authority could be exercised with love, that strength could be tempered with mercy, and that leadership could inspire rather than intimidate. Sauron's philosophy had been built on the premise that power was the ultimate good, that order could only be achieved through absolute control, and that all resistance must be crushed utterly. He believed that the hearts of men were weak and easily corrupted, and that ultimately they would always succumb to the lure of his dominion. But Aragorn, by his very existence and by the example of his rule, shattered these dark tenets. He showed that power, when wielded justly and with humility, could be a force for healing and creation, not just for destruction. He demonstrated that true order arose not from forced subjugation, but from shared purpose and mutual respect. And he proved that the hearts of men, though susceptible to shadows, could also hold an unyielding flame of courage, loyalty, and enduring hope. The victory over Sauron was not merely the destruction of a tangible foe, but the profound repudiation of his entire worldview. It was the triumph of selfless service over tyrannical ambition, of communal flourishing over individual dominance, and of the quiet, enduring good over the spectacular, destructive evil. And in the long, peaceful reign of Aragorn, the light that had been kindled in the darkest hours continued to shine, a beacon of what Middle-earth could be when guided by a true king a ruler who understood that his greatest strength lay not in his might, but in his unwavering commitment to the well-being of his people and to the healing of a broken world. The fear that had gripped the Dark Lord in the heart of his power was the fear of this light, this truth, this enduring nobility, a truth that ultimately proved to be his undoing and the salvation of Middle-earth. And so the ages turned, and the memory of the great war and the great king became a part of the very fabric of the world. A story whispered on the wind, a legend carried in the hearts of men, reminding all that even in the longest night, a dawn will always break. The echoes of that dawn, long past, still resonate in the quiet corners of the world, a testament to the enduring power of such tales. For the story of Aragorn, Elessar, the king of the reunited kingdom, did not end with the defeat of Sauron. It began anew, a long and arduous journey of rebuilding, healing, and fostering a peace that had been absent for centuries. His reign, though often overshadowed by the dramatic conflict that preceded it, was perhaps the truest fulfillment of his destiny, the embodiment of that very light which Sauron so profoundly feared. Consider the landscape of Middle-earth in the Fourth Age. As Aragorn took up the scepter of his ancestors, it was a world scarred not only by the immediate devastation of the War of the Ring, but by millennia of conflict, by the slow, creeping decay of ancient evils, and by the fading of the elder races. Gondor, though victorious, was diminished, its lands depopulated, its strength strained. Rohan, though courageous, bore the wounds of war. The north, where Aragorn himself had wandered for so long, was wild and untamed, its ancient glories long forgotten by most. The task before him was monumental, far greater than wielding a sword in battle. It was the task of governance, of justice, of inspiration, of bringing disparate peoples together under a banner of shared purpose and benevolent rule. His first act, after the coronation, was not one of conquest or retribution, but of mercy and renewal. He pardoned many of those who had served Sauron unwillingly, offering them a chance to rebuild their lives. He acknowledged the ancient treaties and alliances, reinforcing the bonds between Gondor and Rohan, and extending his hand to the peoples of the north. He understood that true strength lay not in dominance, but in unity and mutual respect. He also turned his attention to the restoration of the land itself. The fields of Gondor, long neglected, were tilled and sown. The ancient roads, fallen into disrepair, were mended. The cities, particularly Minas Tirith, were lovingly restored, not just to their former glory, but to a new vibrancy, infused with the spirit of a just and benevolent king. Aragorn's wisdom was not merely in policy, but in his understanding of the hearts of men. He knew that hope, once rekindled, needed constant tending. He travelled extensively throughout his kingdom, not as a distant monarch, but as a shepherd among his flock, listening to the grievances of his people, offering counsel, and sharing in their joys and sorrows. He was a king who walked among his subjects, who remembered the names of common folk, and whose presence brought a sense of peace and security. This personal touch, this genuine care for his people, was a stark contrast to the distant, oppressive shadow of Sauron, who saw his subjects only as instruments of his will. His relationship with the Elves, though they were soon to depart Middle-earth, was one of deep respect and affection. He continued to correspond with Legolas, and his bond with Arwen, his queen, was a constant reminder of the ancient lineage and the enduring beauty that still lingered in the world. He understood the bittersweet nature of their fading, and though he grieved their departure, he honored their legacy and sought to incorporate their wisdom into the fabric of his new kingdom. The Elves, in turn, recognized in Aragorn the true heir of the Númenorian kings, a mortal man imbued with a nobility that rivaled their own. His friendship with the hobbits, too, remained a cherished bond. He declared the Shire a free land, protected by royal decree, ensuring their unique way of life would continue undisturbed. He often visited them, and the affection was mutual, for they saw in him not just a king, but a friend, a man who remembered their courage and their simple virtues. This act of protecting the small and the unassuming was another subtle rebuke to Sauron's philosophy, which valued only power and grandeur. Perhaps one of the most profound aspects of Aragorn's reign was his commitment to justice. He re-established the ancient laws of Gondor, tempered with mercy, and ensured that all, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant, were equal before them. He rooted out corruption and inefficiency, not with harsh purges, but with patient reform and the appointment of wise and honest officials. He understood that a kingdom built on fear and injustice would ultimately crumble, as Sauron's had. A just society, however, would stand firm against any future darkness. He also devoted himself to the preservation of knowledge and history, understanding that a people without memory are a people without direction. He ordered the restoration of the archives of Minas Tirith and encouraged the chronicling of the events of his age, ensuring that the lessons of the past would not be forgotten. He understood that the stories of heroism and sacrifice, of both great kings and humble hobbits, were vital to the health and spirit of his realm. His long reign, lasting for 122 years, was a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity for the peoples of the West. The borders of the reunited kingdom expanded, not through conquest, but through the re-establishment of ancient territories and the willing accession of peoples seeking the protection and justice of the king Elessar. The strength of Gondor and Arnor, reunited at last, brought stability to much of Middle-earth. The wild lands of the north became safer, the roads more secure, and trade flourished. Yet, even in this golden age, the shadow of mortality remained. Aragorn, though of the long-lived line of the Dúnedain, was still a man. As his life drew to a close, he faced his end with the same courage and dignity that had marked his entire life. He knew that the gift of men, though often seen as a curse by the Elves, was also a source of strength, allowing them to depart the world and make way for what was to come. He passed on the crown to his son, Eldarion, having prepared him well for the responsibilities of kingship, ensuring that the legacy of his rule would continue. His farewell to Arwen was perhaps the most poignant moment of his passing, a testament to the profound love that bound them and the sorrow of their ultimate separation. He chose the time of his death, as had his ancestor Elendil, laying down his life willingly, not clinging to it out of fear. This final act solidified his wisdom and his noble spirit, proving that he was indeed a king worthy of the ancient lineage, a man who understood the cycles of life and death and accepted his place within them. The fear that Sauron had harbored, that deep-seated terror of Aragorn, was not just of a powerful warrior or a cunning strategist. It was the fear of a complete antithesis to his own being. Sauron was a spirit of domination, craving absolute control, seeing power as an end in itself. Aragorn was a spirit of service, understanding power as a means to foster life, healing, and freedom. Sauron desired to crush the will of others, to make them subservient. Aragorn sought to uplift and empower his people, to nurture their diverse strengths. Sauron's vision was one of a sterile, uniform order imposed by force. Aragorn's vision was of a flourishing, diverse society, bound by love, justice, and shared purpose. Sauron's philosophy, born of Morgoth's corruption, was a profound pessimism regarding the nature of being, a belief that true order could only arise from subjugation, and that freedom inevitably led to chaos. Aragorn, guided by the ancient wisdom of his forefathers and the timeless virtues of justice and compassion, offered a living refutation of this dark creed. His reign proved that harmony could exist without tyranny, that strength could be found in vulnerability, and that enduring peace was built not on fear, but on hope and mutual respect. In the long years of his rule, Aragorn did not merely defeat Sauron. He dismantled the very foundations of Sauron's ideology. He showed the world that the long defeat, foretold by the Elves, was not an inevitability, but a challenge to be met with courage and enduring spirit. He demonstrated that even after millennia of darkness, the light of true kingship, rooted in humility and service, could once again illuminate the world. The memory of his reign became a golden thread in the tapestry of Middle-earth's history, a constant reminder that even in the face of overwhelming evil, the quiet, persistent good can ultimately prevail. And that is why Sauron truly feared Aragorn, because Aragorn represented everything Sauron could never be, and everything Sauron knew deep down would ultimately prove stronger than all his might and malice. His very existence was a prophecy of Sauron's undoing, a living testament to the enduring hope that even in the deepest shadow, a true king would arise, bringing with him the dawn of a new age, an age that Sauron, in his profound darkness, could never comprehend or conquer. The story of Aragorn, however, does not end with the defeat of Sauron and the crowning of a king. Indeed, his reign, so pivotal and long desired, marked not an ending, but a crucial transition, a final flourishing of the Age of Men, before the world would slowly, inevitably, begin its long, slow fading. His lineage, stretching back through the ages to the First Age, to Elros Tar Miniatur, the first king of Númenor, and even further to the half-elven line of Elendil and Elwing, was a burden and a blessing. It connected him to the ancient majesty of both elves and men, to the heroic deeds and tragic falls of ages past. This deep ancestry shaped his understanding of kingship, distinguishing him profoundly from the self-proclaimed lords of lesser men who had risen and fallen in the long centuries of Middle-earth's decline. Aragorn, as King Elisar Telcontar, understood that his rule was not merely about wielding power, but about restoring a broken world. The lands of Gondor and Arnor, once thriving kingdoms, were diminished. The former glory of Arnor, the northern kingdom, was but a memory, its lands desolate, its people scattered. Gondor, though still mighty, had been bled dry by constant vigilance against Mordor, its strength waning, its population thinned. His first task, then, was healing and rebuilding. He began by turning his attention to the depleted lands, fostering agriculture, revitalizing trade routes, and re-establishing the rule of law and justice in places where it had long been forgotten. He sent forth messengers and surveyors, not with demands for tribute, but with offers of aid and protection, seeking to knit together the sundered realms. One of his earliest acts, demonstrating his unique vision of kingship, was the restoration of justice and the cleansing of the wild lands. He pardoned many men who had fought under Sauron's banner, acknowledging that many had been coerced or deceived, offering them a chance to rebuild their lives in peace. This act of mercy, rather than vengeance, spoke volumes of his character and set a new standard for leadership in Middle-earth. He understood that true strength lay not in retribution, but in reconciliation and the slow, patient work of fostering trust. Crucially, he did not forget the North. He took up the mantle of the High King of the Dúnedain, uniting the once separate crowns of Gondor and Arnor. He sent forth his people to resettle the ancient lands of Arnor, particularly the fertile plains of Eriador that had lain fallow for centuries. The Shire, that quiet corner of the world he had once protected as Thorongil, received his special care. He issued a decree forbidding any man from entering its borders without the permission of the hobbits themselves, and reaffirmed its status as a free land under his protection. This was a testament to his gratitude and understanding of the simple, uncorrupted goodness that the hobbits represented. He knew that such places, seemingly insignificant, were vital to the health of the broader world. His friendship with the Elves, especially with Legolas and the Elves of Mirkwood, and with the remaining Elves of Rivendell and Lothlorien, was another cornerstone of his reign. He journeyed often to the north, seeking counsel from Elrond and Círdan, and the other wise ones who still lingered in Middle-earth. These journeys were not just for advice. They were an affirmation of the enduring bonds between the races, a bridge between the fading glory of the elder days and the emerging age of men. When Arwen, his beloved, chose mortality to be with him, her presence as queen was a living symbol of this connection, a profound reminder of the sacrifice and choice that stood at the heart of their love and his destiny. She was a queen of grace and wisdom, and her quiet strength complemented his kingly bearing, helping to guide the newly united kingdoms. The rebuilding of Minas Tirith itself was a monumental task. The city, though victorious, bore the scars of war. Aragorn oversaw its restoration, not merely as a military stronghold, but as a vibrant centre of culture and learning. He encouraged the arts, the sciences, and the study of ancient lore, seeking to revive the intellectual and spiritual life of Gondor. The White Tree, that potent symbol of kingship and life, was found by him on Mindolluin's slopes and replanted in the court of the fountain, its new growth a powerful omen of renewed hope and prosperity. His rule was marked by a deep respect for tradition, but not a slavish adherence to it. He sought out the ancient laws and customs of his ancestors, particularly those of Númenor, and re-established them where they fostered justice and well-being. Yet he was also pragmatic, adapting to the needs of a changing world, always prioritizing the welfare of his people. He was a king who walked among his subjects, not distant and aloof, but engaged and compassionate. He knew the names of farmers in remote villages, understood the concerns of craftsmen in the city, and listened to the pleas of the common folk. This personal touch, this genuine care, endeared him to his people and solidified his authority far more than any display of martial prowess ever could. The threat of darkness, though Sauron was gone, did not entirely vanish overnight. Remnants of evil still lingered in the far corners of the world, and there were indeed skirmishes and campaigns waged during his reign to cleanse these last pockets of shadow. However, these were not the existential threats of old, but rather the necessary maintenance of a newly established peace. His campaigns into Harad and Rhûn, for instance, were not conquests for glory, but expeditions to secure the borders of his realm, to bring order and protection to lands that had long been under the sway of Mordor's influence. He sought to establish peaceful relations with these formerly hostile peoples, offering them trade and alliances rather than perpetual enmity. Aragorn's relationship with the other races of Middle-earth deepened during his time as king. He confirmed the autonomy of Rohan under King Eomer, upholding the ancient alliance between their peoples. He maintained warm relations with the Iron Hills dwarves under King Thorin III, Stonehelm and the Lonely Mountain dwarves under King Dain, Ironfoot's son, bringing their craftsmanship and mining skills to aid in the reconstruction of Gondor. His reign truly was a new era of cooperation and understanding, an attempt to mend the divisions and animosities that Sauron had so skillfully exploited for centuries. But even as Aragorn built and healed, he lived with the knowledge of the inevitable fading. He knew that the time of the Elves in Middle-earth was drawing to a close. With the destruction of the One Ring, the power of the Elven Rings, which had preserved the beauty and vitality of places like Rivendell and Lothlorien, began to wane. The Elves, who had lived for millennia, felt the pull of the Grey Havens more strongly than ever. Aragorn understood this, and though it brought him sorrow, he accepted it as part of the grand tapestry of Eru's design. He bid farewell to his dear friends, Gandalf and Elrond, and many others, as they sailed west, leaving Middle-earth to the dominion of men. This departure of the Eldar was a poignant reminder that even the greatest victories come with a touch of melancholy, a sense of loss for things that can never quite return. The years passed, long and prosperous, under his wise rule. He oversaw the repopulation and flourishing of Gondor and Arnor, the re-establishment of trade and culture, and the slow, difficult process of healing the deep wounds left by Sauron's long shadow. Aragorn, King Elessar, reigned for 122 years, a remarkably long life for a man, a testament to his Númenorian heritage and the choices he had made. He had restored the glory of the House of Elendil, brought peace to a war-torn land, and laid the foundations for a new age. In his final years, Aragorn felt the approaching end of his long life. He knew his time was near, and he had prepared for it with the same calm dignity that had marked his entire existence. He passed the crown to his son, Eldarion, a worthy heir born of his union with Arwen. Their parting was filled with deep love and profound sorrow, a final, heart-wrenching moment that encapsulated the bittersweet nature of their choice and the unique destiny they shared. Arwen, having chosen mortality, remained behind to live out the remainder of her days in the fading world she had chosen, a final, poignant echo of the elves who had departed. She walked alone to Terin Amroth in Lothlorien, the place where she and Aragorn had plighted their troth, and there she lay down to rest, the last star of her people to fade from Middle-earth. Aragorn, King Elessar, died in peace, in the comfort of his own bed, having fulfilled his destiny completely. His death marked not a defeat, but a triumphant completion of his purpose. He had not merely vanquished an enemy, he had established a legacy. His reign, the age of the reunited kingdom, was a golden age for men, a period of renewed hope and strength in Middle-earth. He had proven that even after millennia of darkness, the true spirit of kingship, rooted in humility, service, and a profound love for the world, could overcome the most terrifying evil. And so, the fear that Sauron harbored for Aragorn was not just a fear of a future king, but a fear of the fundamental truth that Aragorn embodied. That goodness, when pursued with courage and wisdom, possesses an inherent strength that can ultimately dismantle even the most absolute power founded on malice. Sauron's dominion was built on fear, on lies, on the suppression of life and individuality. Aragorn's kingship was built on hope, on truth, on the nurturing of life and the celebration of freedom. Sauron, in his deep-seated corruption, could never truly comprehend such a power, such a victory, and that incomprehension, that stark contrast to his own being, was the ultimate source of his profound and well-founded dread. Aragorn was the living refutation of everything Sauron believed to be true about power, about order, and about the very nature of existence. And in the end, the king of men, born of ancient lineage yet living in the present, proved Sauron's dark creed wrong, not with overwhelming force, but with unwavering light. His story remains a quiet testament to the enduring power of hope against the shadow, a lullaby of heroism whispered across the ages. The tale of Aragorn, therefore, is not merely a chronicle of battles won or foes vanquished, but a profound exploration of what it means to be a true leader, a true king in a world teetering on the brink of despair. His journey from the lonely strider of the Wilderland to the crowned King Elessar of the reunited kingdom is a tapestry woven with threads of ancient prophecy, personal sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the good of Middle-earth. It illustrates how the will of an individual, when aligned with justice and propelled by love, can alter the destiny of entire peoples and reshape the very fabric of history. Consider, for a moment, the vast span of time that preceded Aragorn's emergence, the long, slow decline of the Númenorian line, the fading of the Dúnedain in the north, their kingdoms fractured and their strength diminished. The remnants of that proud lineage, the chieftains of the Dúnedain of the north, had for centuries lived lives of quiet vigil, ever guarding the borders against the encroaching darkness. Yet their very existence was a secret to most of the world. They were wanderers, rangers, their heritage a heavy burden, their future uncertain. Aragorn, born a mere babe in the year 2931 of the Third Age, was swiftly hidden away after the death of his father, Arathorn the Ten, slain by orcs. His mother, Gilraen, a woman of great sorrow and foreboding, understood the perils that lay ahead. She took him to Rivendell, to the care of Elrond half-elven, the very lord who had once fostered his ancestor, Isildur. It was here, in the tranquil valley of Imladris, that Aragorn was raised, though his true name and lineage were kept secret for many years. He was called Estel, meaning hope, a name that would prove profoundly prophetic. Elrond, with his ancient wisdom and foresight, knew the weight of the destiny that rested upon the boy. He understood the profound significance of Aragorn's ancestry, the mingling of elvish and human bloodlines, the direct descent from the kings of Númenor, and through them from the revered house of Elros, Elrond's own brother. This heritage was both a blessing and a curse, a promise of greatness and a magnet for the shadow. For nearly 2 decades, Estel grew in wisdom and strength, learning the lore of his people, the skills of a warrior, and the ways of healing. He learned the ancient tongues, the stories of the First Age, the triumphs and tragedies of his forebears, but the true knowledge of his identity, the revelation of his royal blood, and the shards of Narsil, the sword that had cut the ring from Sauron's hand, was withheld until he came of age. In his 20th year, Elrond finally revealed to him his true name, Aragorn, and his lineage, presenting him with the ring of Barad-dûr, a silver serpent with emerald eyes, a symbol of his descent from the ancient lords of Andunia and the House of Beor, and the shards of Narsil. It was a moment of profound revelation, a stark unveiling of a destiny that had been patiently awaiting him. Aragorn accepted this burden with quiet solemnity, though the weight of it must have been immense. He knew then that the path ahead would be fraught with peril, that he was called to a task that had defeated many before him. It was also during this time that he first beheld Arwen Undomiel, Elrond's daughter, returning from Lothlorien, her beauty, mirroring that of Luthien Tinuviel of old, captivated him. And in that moment, a love was kindled that would shape his entire life, intertwining his mortal destiny with the immortal fate of the Elves. He had seen the future queen, though neither of them knew it then. For the next decades, Aragorn lived the life of a ranger, a wanderer in the wild, ever vigilant against the servants of the shadow. He journeyed far and wide, through the forests of Eriador, the borders of Rohan, and even into the lands of the east and south, gaining invaluable knowledge of Middle-earth and its peoples. He served in the armies of Rohan and Gondor under various disguises, never revealing his true identity, learning the arts of war and leadership from practical experience. He was known as Thorongil, the Eagle of the Star, in those days a valiant captain whose deeds were sung in distant lands. His true purpose, however, remained the defense of the free peoples, the quiet, unceasing battle against the growing power of Sauron. He hunted orcs and drove back dark creatures, protecting the unwary and the weak, a silent guardian in a world that had all but forgotten its ancient kings. This long period of testing, of hardship, and self-imposed exile from the comforts of Rivendell forged him into the man he needed to be. He was not merely a king by birthright, but a king by experience, by suffering, by a profound dedication to his people. The years passed, and the shadow deepened. The Nazgûl, the ring-wraiths, returned to Mordor, and Sauron's power grew, culminating in the return of the One Ring to the world. It was at this critical juncture, in the year 3018, that Aragorn's path definitively converged with that of Frodo Baggins, the ring-bearer. They met in Bree at the Prancing Pony, where Aragorn, known then as Strider, offered his protection to the hobbits, sensing the dire peril that encompassed them. His presence, initially met with suspicion, soon proved invaluable. He led them through the treacherous lands, protecting them from the Black Riders, guiding them to Rivendell. His wisdom, his tracking skills, his courage, and his deep understanding of the dangers they faced were evident from the outset. He was the quiet strength that allowed the quest to continue. At the Council of Elrond, the full weight of his destiny was finally brought into the open. He stood before the representatives of all free peoples, a man of humble appearance, yet bearing the lineage of kings. It was there that Elrond publicly affirmed his identity, and the shards of Narsil, the sword of Elendil, were reforged into Andúril, the flame of the West, a symbol of his renewed claim to the throne of Gondor. This was a pivotal moment, a public declaration of his intent to reclaim his heritage and confront the encroaching darkness. He joined the Fellowship of the Ring, not as a leader, but as a protector, a guide, his ancient wisdom and martial prowess crucial to their survival. He was the one who could interpret the signs, the one who understood the ancient evils and the perils of the wild. His journey with the Fellowship was a crucible. He faced the horrors of Moria, the grief of Gandalf's apparent death, and the temptation of the Ring, a temptation that, given his lineage and potential power, would have been immense. But Aragorn, unlike his ancestor Isildur, possessed a strength of will, a humility forged in years of service and self-denial, that allowed him to resist its corrupting influence. He understood the Ring was not an instrument of power to be wielded, but an evil to be destroyed. After the breaking of the Fellowship, his path diverged from Frodo's. He chose to follow Merry and Pippin, captured by orcs, a decision that underscored his unwavering commitment to his friends and his deep-seated sense of responsibility. He, along with Legolas and Gimli, embarked on a relentless pursuit, a desperate race across Rohan, demonstrating his extraordinary endurance and tracking abilities. This chase ultimately led him to the ancient forest of Fangorn, to the returned Gandalf the White, a reunion that rekindled hope and solidified their resolve. His journey then became one of rallying the forces of men against Sauron. He embraced his kingship, not with ambition, but with a profound sense of duty. He went to the paths of the dead, a perilous undertaking that few mortals would dare, to summon the Oathbreakers, the spectral army of the dead men of Dunharrow, who were bound by an ancient curse to serve the King of Gondor. This act, a testament to his courage and his rightful claim to the throne, was a turning point. The spectral host, led by Aragorn, swept down upon the corsairs of Umbar at Pelag-gur, freeing the ships of the south from Sauron's sway, allowing the armies of the fiefs of Gondor to reach Minas Tirith in time for the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. At the Pelennor, Aragorn arrived with the Black Fleet, filled not with enemies, but with the men of the south, turning the tide of battle. His presence, his banner unfurled, bearing the white tree of Gondor and the 7 stars, was a beacon of hope, a symbol of the return of the king. He fought with valor and skill, inspiring the defenders and striking fear into the hearts of Sauron's forces. But even after this great victory, he understood that the true war was not yet won. The eye of Sauron would remain fixed on Minas Tirith, and Frodo's quest to destroy the ring would fail if all attention was not diverted from Mordor. Thus, he made the daring decision to march to the Black Gate, to challenge Sauron directly, to draw out the remaining forces of the enemy, knowing full well it was a suicide mission. This act of profound self-sacrifice, of leading an army against impossible odds, was not born of pride, but of a deep love for Middle-earth and a complete understanding of the desperate need to buy Frodo time. He stood before the amassed might of Mordor, a tiny flicker of hope against an overwhelming darkness, knowing that the fate of the world rested on the shoulders of a small hobbit far away. It was a bluff, a magnificent act of courage and cunning, designed to distract the eye of Sauron and allow the ring-bearer to complete his task. And in the end, it worked. The destruction of the ring, concurrent with the desperate battle at the Black Gate, brought about Sauron's final downfall. With the defeat of Sauron, Aragorn finally ascended to the throne of Gondor, crowned King Elisar Tel Kontar, the Elfstone Strider. His reign marked the beginning of a new age, the Fourth Age, an era of peace and prosperity for men. He married Arwen, uniting the lines of elves and men once more, fulfilling the ancient prophecy of their ancestors. He rebuilt Gondor, restored the White Tree, and established a just and wise rule. He brought peace to Middle-earth, healed old wounds, and fostered friendship between disparate peoples. He reigned for 120 years, a long and glorious reign, before willingly laying down his life, passing into the West, his spirit at peace. Aragorn's entire life was a testament to the enduring power of hope, of self-sacrifice, and of the profound responsibility that comes with leadership. He was not a king who sought power, but one who was called to serve. His journey from an unknown ranger to the crowned king of the reunited kingdom is a powerful narrative of destiny fulfilled, of ancient lineage reclaimed, and of the triumph of good over evil. His story echoes the deep themes of Tolkien's world: the long defeat, the fading of the elves, the rising of men, and the courage of the individual against overwhelming darkness. It is a story whispered through the ages, a gentle reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope embodied in a true heart can ultimately prevail. Yet, to truly understand the depth of Sauron's fear of Aragorn, we must delve beyond the surface of these grand events, beyond the immediate tactical brilliance of the Black Gate, and indeed beyond even the climactic destruction of the Ring. Sauron, ancient and powerful, a mire of immense stature, had seen the rise and fall of ages. He had witnessed the might of Númenor broken, the last alliance of elves and men shattered, and he had learned, through millennia of bitter experience, the true nature of power and the vulnerabilities of his enemies. His fear of Aragorn was not a simple apprehension of a strong warrior or a cunning general, but a profound, almost existential dread, born of his own twisted understanding of dominion and control. Sauron's entire being was predicated on order, an absolute, unyielding order imposed by his will. He despised chaos, or what he perceived as such, and sought to mold Middle-earth into a perfect, predictable reflection of his own dark mind. His power grew from fear, from domination, from the subjugation of free wills. He saw weakness in compassion, foolishness in hope, and utter madness in self-sacrifice. He believed that all beings, especially men, were ultimately driven by self-interest, by the lust for power or the fear of death, and could therefore be bought, corrupted, or broken. This was his fundamental miscalculation, the blind spot in his otherwise vast and ancient wisdom. Aragorn, however, embodied everything Sauron could not comprehend, and therefore could not control. He was a man, yes, but not one easily swayed by the lures of power. He had lived a life of anonymity, of service, of humble protection, when he could have claimed his birthright much earlier. He had walked among his people, understanding their struggles, not from a distant throne, but from the dusty roads and wild forests. This profound connection to the common folk, this willingness to serve rather than simply rule, was alien to Sauron. He saw kings as instruments of power, tools to be wielded or broken, not as shepherds of their people. Aragorn's humility was a shield against Sauron's corrupting influence, a quality the Dark Lord simply did not possess, and thus could not truly understand. Furthermore, Aragorn carried the lineage of Númenor, the bloodline of kings who had once challenged Sauron himself. He was a direct descendant of Elendil, who had helped cast down Sauron in the last alliance, and even further back to Elendil and the Eldar of the West. This heritage was not merely a matter of blood, but of spirit. It carried with it a memory of an age when men were noble and wise, when they walked with the elves, and when they had defied the very essence of Morgoth's darkness, from whom Sauron drew his ultimate inspiration. Sauron had witnessed the corruption of Númenor, the pride that led to its downfall, and he believed that all men of that line were inherently susceptible to the same temptations. But Aragorn had resisted. He had taken up the shards of Narsil, not out of a thirst for vengeance or dominion, but out of a sense of duty, a desire to heal and restore. He had proven himself immune to the ring's temptation, a feat that few could accomplish, a testament to his inner strength and noble heart. This was a direct refutation of Sauron's cynical view of men, and it struck a deep chord of unease within the Dark Lord. The very name Elfstone Strider, Elisar Telcontar, was a whisper of defiance to Sauron. It spoke of a king who embraced both the ancient wisdom of the elves and the enduring strength of men, a union that Sauron had always sought to prevent. The Elfstone itself, given by Galadriel, was a symbol of hope and healing, a beacon against the encroaching shadow. Sauron's power thrived in division, in the sundering of races and peoples. Aragorn, by uniting the disparate elements of Middle-earth, by bringing together the men of the West and the men of the North, by fostering trust between men and elves, directly undermined Sauron's strategy of divide and conquer. He was building a new alliance, not of necessity, born of a desperate war, but of mutual respect and shared purpose, a force that Sauron, in his isolation, could never truly comprehend or counter. Then there was the matter of Aragorn's destiny, intertwined with the fading of the elves and the rising of men. Sauron, as a spirit of the First Age, had witnessed the grandeur of the elves and their gradual retreat from Middle-earth. He understood the long defeat, the slow diminishment of beauty and light in the world. He believed that with the elves gone and the glory of Númenor a distant memory, men would inevitably fall into barbarism and become easy prey for his dominion. Aragorn, however, represented the dawn of a new age, a true king of men who would lead his people not into darkness, but into a period of renewed strength and wisdom. He represented the flourishing of humanity, not its decline. This was an existential threat to Sauron's long-term plans, a disruption of the natural order as he envisioned it. He wanted a world where men were slaves, not sovereigns, where they were instruments of his will, not masters of their own destiny. Aragorn was a living embodiment of the rejection of that future. Moreover, Aragorn possessed a profound understanding of sacrifice, not as a weakness, but as the ultimate expression of strength. His willingness to ride to the Black Gate, a death sentence for almost any other leader, was incomprehensible to Sauron. The Dark Lord saw self-preservation as the highest virtue, and the offering of one's life for a greater good as utter folly. He believed that fear of death was the ultimate lever, the one thing that could break any will. But Aragorn, by embracing the possibility of his own end for the sake of others, demonstrated a freedom from this fear that Sauron could not fathom. This made Aragorn unpredictable, uncontrollable, and fundamentally dangerous. A foe who does not fear death, who is willing to lay down his life for a cause beyond himself, is a foe against whom Sauron's primary weapon, terror, is rendered impotent. The very act of healing, of restoring what was broken, was anathema to Sauron. His power lay in corruption, in twisting and distorting. Aragorn, through his lineage, held the king's healing hands, a power that could restore life and hope. This was not a magical ability in the conventional sense, but a manifestation of his inherent goodness and his rightful claim to the throne. The healing of the sick, the restoration of the White Tree, the rebuilding of Gondor, these were acts of creation and renewal that directly opposed Sauron's spirit of destruction and decay. He brought life where Sauron brought death, hope where Sauron brought despair, and unity where Sauron brought division. Finally, there was the matter of Aragorn's will. Sauron was a master of will, projecting his thoughts, dominating lesser minds. He believed that all wills could eventually be broken or co-opted. But Aragorn possessed a will forged in hardship, tempered by centuries of noble blood and guided by a profound moral compass. He was not easily shaken, not easily swayed. His steadfastness, his unwavering commitment to justice and righteousness, was a bulwark against Sauron's psychological warfare. The Palantir, for instance, which Sauron used to great effect to sow doubt and fear, was used by Aragorn to challenge the Dark Lord directly, to reveal himself as the rightful heir, and to distract Sauron's eye. This was an act of incredible courage and mental fortitude, a testament to a will that could not be dominated. So, when Sauron's eye fell upon Aragorn, particularly in the lead-up to the final confrontation, he did not see merely a man. He saw the embodiment of all that he had sought to destroy and corrupt for millennia. He saw the return of the ancient kings of men, pure and unbowed. He saw the resurgence of hope, the unification of peoples, and the defiance of his absolute dominion. He saw a man who was immune to his primary weapons, fear, corruption, and the lust for power. He saw a leader who would not merely defeat him, but undo all that he had built, stone by dark stone, in Middle-earth. This was a fear far deeper than tactical concern. It was a fear of the ultimate failure of his philosophy, a profound dread that his understanding of the world, his very essence, was flawed and ultimately doomed. Aragorn was an intractable problem, an anomaly in Sauron's meticulously calculated universe. He was the living proof that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, goodness, courage, and self-sacrifice could ultimately prevail. This was why Sauron truly feared Aragorn, a fear that transcended the battlefield and touched the very core of his ancient, malevolent being. It was the fear of light returning, of order that was not his own, and of a world where his power would at last be broken, not by force alone, but by the enduring spirit of free peoples, led by a true and noble king. And this fear, this deep-seated dread, was not born in a single moment, but had roots stretching back into the very dawn of Middle-earth, long before Aragorn drew his first breath. It was a fear woven into the fabric of Sauron's own history, a bitter echoing of his past failures and the persistent, nagging awareness that he was not truly master of all things, despite his greatest efforts. To understand this fully, we must journey back, far back, to the very beginning of Sauron's long and dreadful path. He was not always known as Sauron, the Dark Lord. In the primordial days, he was Mairon, a spirit of the Maya, a lesser Ainu, one of those who descended into Arda with the Valar. And Mairon, in those distant ages, was a spirit of considerable might and skill. He was a craftsman, a smith, deeply interested in the material world and its workings. He served Aule the smith, the Valar who shaped the mountains and the lands, and from Aule, Myron learned much of artistry and creation. There was no inherent evil in him then, only a desire for order, for efficiency, for things to be done perfectly according to his own meticulous designs. But this very desire, this yearning for unblemished order, held within it the seed of his eventual corruption. For while Myron desired order, he also chafed against the perceived inefficiency and slowness of the Valar's ways. He saw their patience as weakness, their allowance for growth and change as a hindrance to true perfection. And then came Melkor, the great rebel, the first Dark Lord, the mightiest of the Valar, who had marred the music of the Ainur, injecting discord into the very creation of the world. Melkor, with his immense power and his seductive promises of swift and absolute dominion, appealed to that part of Myron that craved control. He offered the means to achieve that perfect order, to shape the world entirely according to a single will, without the messy interference of others. Myron, drawn by Melkor's power and purpose, fell. He became Sauron, the abhorred, Melkor's chief lieutenant, his most trusted and cunning servant. He learned much from Melkor, not just of smithcraft, but of sorcery, of deception, of the manipulation of minds and wills. He became a master of disguises, a shapeshifter of terrible power, able to assume forms of great beauty or monstrous horror. He helped Melkor build his fortresses, devise his weapons, and wage his devastating wars against the Elves and the Valar in the First Age. He was responsible for many atrocities, for the torment of innocents, for the capture of heroes. Yet, even in his service to Melkor, a shadow of his original self remained, a deep understanding of the intricacies of creation, now twisted to serve destructive ends. But even with Melkor, he witnessed failure. Despite his master's unimaginable power, despite the devastation he wrought, Melkor was ultimately defeated, captured by the Valar, and eventually cast out into the outer void. This defeat, this ultimate downfall of his seemingly omnipotent master, must have been a profound lesson for Sauron. He saw that even the greatest power could be overthrown, that even the most absolute dominion could be broken. It instilled in him a certain caution, a desire to avoid the same fate, to learn from Melkor's mistakes. After Melkor's banishment, Sauron attempted to repent, or at least appeared to. He feigned remorse before Eönwë, the herald of Manwë, requesting pardon. But his repentance was not true. It was born of fear, not of genuine change of heart. He could not bring himself to face the judgment of the Valar, to humble himself utterly. So he fled, hiding in the shadows of Middle-earth, biding his time, slowly amassing power once more. The Second Age saw Sauron rise again, not as a mere lieutenant, but as a Dark Lord in his own right. He learned from Melkor's overt brutality, understanding that direct, unconcealed power often met strong resistance. Instead, he chose a path of subtlety, of deception. He came to the Elves of Eregion in a fair guise, calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He offered his knowledge of smithcraft, his apparent wisdom, to help them create wonders. He sought to ensnare them, to bind their power to his own. And here we see the genesis of the ring lore, the crafting of the rings of power, a crucial element in his grand design for dominion. He poured a great part of his own being, his own power, into the one ring, believing that through it he could control all other rings, and thus all those who wore them. But even this cunning plan met with defiance. The elves, particularly Celebrimbor, the greatest smith among them, eventually perceived his malevolent intent. They took off their rings, refusing to be dominated. This was another setback, another instance where Sauron's will was thwarted, and it fueled his hatred for the elves, for their stubborn resistance to his order. He waged terrible wars against them, laying waste to Eregion, but he could not entirely crush them. They endured, retreating to safe havens like Rivendell. Then came the Númenorians, the men of the West, descendants of those who had fought alongside the elves against Melkor in the First Age. They were gifted by the Valar with long life, wisdom, and strength, dwelling on a star-shaped island between Middle-earth and the Undying Lands. For a time, they were allies of the elves and enemies of Sauron. Their might was such that when they finally landed in Middle-earth, led by Ar-Pharazôn, Sauron's armies dared not face them. Sauron, in a masterful act of psychological warfare, surrendered himself. His surrender was a calculated move, not a defeat. He allowed himself to be taken captive to Númenor, intending to corrupt them from within, and he succeeded spectacularly. He played upon their fear of death, their envy of the elves' immortality, and their resentment of the Valar's ban on sailing west to the Undying Lands. He twisted their hearts, turning them to the worship of Melkor, encouraging them to pursue dominion over Middle-earth, and ultimately to challenge the Valar themselves. He convinced Ar-Pharazôn to build a great armada and sail against Valinor, leading to the utter destruction of Númenor, which was drowned beneath the waves in a cataclysm of unimaginable scale. Sauron too was caught in the ruin. His physical form was destroyed, though his spirit, bearing the One Ring, escaped. This was a terrible price to pay, for he could never again assume a fair guise. He was forever after bound to a form of dread and malice. But the destruction of Númenor had an unforeseen consequence. A remnant of the faithful, those Númenorians who had remained loyal to the Valar, escaped. Led by Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, they founded the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor in Middle-earth. These were the Dúnedain, men of immense stature and wisdom, imbued with the strength and lineage of their Númenorian ancestors. It was against these Dúnedain, in the last alliance of elves and men, that Sauron finally faced his greatest defeat of the Second Age. Elendil, the High King of the Dúnedain, and Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor Elves, together confronted Sauron on the slopes of Mount Doom. They struck him down, though they themselves perished in the act. And then came Isildur, Elendil's son, who took up the hilt shard of his father's broken sword, Narsil, and cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand. This was the ultimate humiliation, the ultimate shattering of his power. The ring, his very essence, was taken from him. His spirit fled, diminished, unable to take physical form for centuries. This event, the defeat by the last alliance, the specific act of Isildur severing the ring, became imprinted upon Sauron's very being. It taught him a profound lesson, that when men and elves united, when the ancient lineage of Númenor joined forces with the Eldar, his power, however vast, could be broken. And so, when Sauron began to stir again in the Third Age, slowly regaining his strength in Dol Guldur, and then openly declaring himself and gathering his forces in Mordor, the memory of the defeat, the wound of Isildur's blade, festered within him. He sought the ring above all else, for with it, he believed, he could reclaim his full power and finally achieve absolute dominion, unchallenged and unchallengeable. But even without the ring, he was a formidable force. He raised armies of orcs, trolls, easterlings, and haradrim. He corrupted men with promises of power and wealth, turning entire nations to his service. He sent forth his Nazgûl, the ring-wraiths, terrifying spectres who instilled dread wherever they rode. His eye, vast and terrible, sought out all who opposed him, penetrating minds and crushing spirits. Yet, despite his immense power and the vastness of his armies, there was always that nagging fear, that echo of past failures. He had seen the power of men, particularly the Dúnedain, when they stood united. He had seen their courage, their resilience, their capacity for self-sacrifice. He knew that the line of the kings of men, the heirs of Elendil, had not entirely perished. Though they dwelt in the shadows, their kingdom of Arnor long fallen. He knew that if a true king of men were to rise again, one who could rally the scattered peoples and unite them against him, it would be a challenge unlike any other. And then Aragorn appeared. This was not just any man, not merely a chieftain of rangers. He was the direct descendant of Isildur, the very man who had dealt Sauron his greatest setback. Aragorn carried the lineage of Elendil, the blood of the kings of Númenor, untainted and unbowed. He wielded Andúril, the reforged Narsil, the blade that was broken, the very sword that had cut the ring from Sauron's hand. This was a symbol of immense power, a tangible connection to his greatest defeat. When Sauron's eye, sharpened by millennia of malice and fear, fell upon Aragorn, he did not just see a warrior. He saw history repeating itself, but with a terrifying difference. He saw a man who embodied all the qualities that had led to his downfall before, but now perhaps even stronger, even more determined. Aragorn had the wisdom of the Elves, having been fostered in Rivendell. He had the strength and endurance of the Dúnedain, honed by a lifetime in the wilds. He had the courage and the will of a true king, capable of inspiring loyalty and uniting disparate peoples. Sauron understood the weight of lineage, for he himself was an ancient spirit. He understood the power of symbols, for he had crafted the rings. He understood the potency of a unified will, for he sought to impose his own upon all of Middle-earth. And in Aragorn, he saw the perfect storm of all these elements, the very antithesis of his own dark rule. He saw the potential for a rebirth of the strength that had defeated him before, but this time, perhaps with greater wisdom, less prone to the internal divisions that had plagued men in the past. The thought of a unified Gondor, led by a true king, inspiring the free peoples to stand together, was a nightmare for Sauron. It was a threat to his very philosophy of power, which relied on division, fear, and the corruption of individual wills. He believed that all men were susceptible to his influence, that their desire for power, their fear of death, could always be exploited. But Aragorn, by his very nature, by his unwavering commitment to selfless duty and justice, defied this belief. He was incorruptible, a beacon of hope that Sauron could not extinguish, a will that he could not bend. And so, the fear of Aragorn was not just a fear of a powerful enemy on the battlefield, though he was that too. It was a fear of the ultimate undoing of all his efforts throughout the ages. It was the fear of the return of true order, not the sterile, crushing order he desired, but the vibrant, free order of Valinor, the order that respected individual will and the natural growth of creation. It was the fear of the enduring spirit of Middle-earth, embodied in a single, noble man, rising to cast down the shadow once and for all. This was the deep, ancient, and profound reason why Sauron, the Dark Lord, truly feared Aragorn, the King Elessar. The weight of this fear, though perhaps not a trembling terror in the way a mortal might experience it, was a profound apprehension, a cold calculation within Sauron's ancient mind. He knew the intricate dance of cause and effect, having played a central role in the great struggles of the past. He understood that the threads of fate, though seemingly invisible, were often woven with the choices of individuals, and in Aragorn he saw a man whose choices were consistently aligned against his own dark aspirations, a man whose lineage bespoke a destiny that Sauron had long sought to pervert or extinguish. Consider the long history that led to this confrontation, a history deeply intertwined with the very essence of Middle-earth itself. Sauron, originally Myron, a spirit of the Maya, was once a being of light, a craftsman of great skill, drawn to the order and precision that Melkor, later Morgoth, promised. He sought to bring structure to the chaotic energies of creation, a noble ambition twisted by his master into a desire for absolute control. He learned the arts of deception and domination, honing his power through millennia of service to the first Dark Lord. He witnessed the rise and fall of great kingdoms, the devastating wars against the Elves, and the eventual defeat of Morgoth. Yet, even after Morgoth's banishment into the void, Sauron remained, convinced that he could complete his master's work, that he could impose his will upon all free peoples and bring about a perfected, albeit tyrannical, order. His first great defeat after Morgoth's fall came at the hands of the last alliance of elves and men. It was a moment of profound significance, for it united the two kindreds against a common foe. And who led the men in that alliance? Isildur, a descendant of the kings of Númenor, a man of incredible courage and ultimately a tragic flaw. Sauron remembered well the strength of Elendil, Isildur's father, who had forged the Númenorian realm in Middle-earth after the downfall of their island kingdom. He remembered the might of their armies, their mastery of arms, and their unwavering spirit. Though Isildur succumbed to the ring's temptation, his act of severing the ring from Sauron's hand was a defeat Sauron never forgot. It was a stark reminder that even the mightiest power could be undone by the seemingly insignificant act of a mortal man. The memory of the Dúnedain's power, even in their decline, lingered in his dark thoughts. For Sauron, the very existence of the Dúnedain, the descendants of Númenor, was a thorn in his side, a persistent reminder of a past he wished to erase. He had orchestrated the downfall of Númenor itself, sowing seeds of pride and fear in the hearts of its kings, leading them to defy the Valar and sail west, ultimately destroying their glorious island. He believed he had eradicated the greatest threat posed by men. But a remnant, led by Elendil and his sons, had escaped, carrying with them the seeds of new kingdoms, Gondor and Arnor, in Middle-earth. These kingdoms, though diminished over the long ages, retained the memory of their heritage, the wisdom of their long lives, and the strength of their ancient bloodline. And in Aragorn, Sauron saw the culmination of that heritage, the living embodiment of all that he had sought to destroy. Aragorn was not merely a warrior, he was a healer, a leader of men, a man of profound wisdom and unwavering moral clarity. Unlike many kings before him, Aragorn did not seek power for its own sake, nor was he swayed by the allure of personal glory. His sole desire was to fulfill his duties, to restore the broken line of kings, and to protect the free peoples from the encroaching darkness. This selfless dedication was a mystery to Sauron, who believed all beings were ultimately driven by self-interest and a craving for domination. The prospect of Aragorn taking up the kingship of Gondor was particularly vexing for the Dark Lord. For centuries, Sauron had worked to undermine Gondor's strength, to sow discord among its stewards, and to weaken its defences. He had watched with satisfaction as its borders receded, its population dwindled, and its spirit flagged. He had counted on the internal decay of men, their short lives, their susceptibility to fear and despair, to pave the way for his final victory. But Aragorn's return threatened to reverse all of this. He possessed the ancient right to the throne, a right recognized by the people, even if long dormant. His presence alone could rekindle the flame of hope in the hearts of men, inspiring them to fight with renewed vigor. Sauron's fear of Aragorn was amplified by Aragorn's connection to the Elves. Having been raised in Rivendell, Aragorn was not only schooled in the lore of men, but also in the wisdom and traditions of the Eldar. He spoke their language, understood their history, and shared their deep respect for the natural world. This connection meant that Aragorn possessed a broader perspective, a deeper understanding of the forces at play in Middle-earth than any other mortal man. He was not easily deceived, nor was his resolve easily broken. He had walked among the Eldar, the ancient and wise, and absorbed some of their enduring strength and patience. This elvish influence made him a more formidable opponent, for it imbued him with a foresight and a resilience that was rare among men. Furthermore, Aragorn's role as a ranger, a solitary protector of the wilds, had hardened him in ways that a life within the confines of a court never could. He understood the hidden paths, the whispers of the wind, the signs in the forest. He knew the land intimately, a knowledge that Sauron, in his fortress of Barad-dûr, could never fully possess. While Sauron relied on his armies and his vast networks of spies, Aragorn relied on his own strength, his keen senses, and his unwavering moral compass. He was a force of nature in himself, a man who had faced countless perils in the wilderness and emerged stronger for it. The very name Elessar, bestowed upon Aragorn by the Elves, carried a potent symbolism that Sauron surely recognized. It meant Elfstone, a name that evoked the light and purity of the Eldar, a direct contrast to the darkness and corruption that Sauron embodied. It was a name that spoke of healing and restoration, of the renewal of life and hope in a world shrouded by shadow. For Sauron, who sought to dominate and enslave, the idea of a king whose very essence was tied to healing and freedom was an anathema. The ultimate nightmare for Sauron, the true crystallization of his fear, was the possibility of a unified resistance. He had always thrived on division, on turning race against race, man against man. He had corrupted kings, sown discord among allies, and capitalized on the inherent weaknesses of mortal beings. But Aragorn, by his very presence and his inspiring leadership, threatened to shatter this strategy. He had the potential to unite the disparate peoples of Middle-earth, men, elves, dwarves, and even the hobbits, against a common foe. The arrival of the Rohirrim at the Pelennor fields, the gathering of the Grey Company, the rallying of the men of the fiefs, all were testament to the power of Aragorn's leadership, his ability to inspire loyalty and courage where despair had long reigned. Sauron had long believed that the spirit of men was inherently weak, easily swayed by fear or greed. He saw their short lives as a vulnerability, their mortality as a source of desperation. But Aragorn defied this assumption. He faced death with courage, not despair. He embraced his responsibilities with unwavering commitment, not with self-serving ambition. He was a living refutation of Sauron's cynical view of humanity. And so, the fear of Aragorn was not merely a strategic concern, a calculation of military might. It was a philosophical dread, a deep-seated apprehension that his entire worldview, his millennia-long quest for dominion, was fundamentally flawed. Aragorn represented the enduring power of free will, the resilience of hope, and the inherent goodness that Sauron had long sought to extinguish. He was the embodiment of all that Sauron despised, and all that he could never truly conquer. The final confrontation at the Black Gate, where Aragorn led the remaining forces against the vast armies of Mordor, was a desperate gamble, a diversion engineered to draw Sauron's eye away from the true quest of the Ringbearer. Yet even in that moment, as Aragorn stood before the gates of Mordor, defying the Dark Lord with his mere presence, he was fulfilling his destiny, embodying the hope of ages. Sauron, watching with his terrible eye, saw not just a mortal man, but the culmination of a long lineage, the return of a king, the embodiment of a threat that had haunted him since the First Age. He saw the potential for his ultimate undoing, not by overwhelming force, but by the courage and sacrifice of a single incorruptible man. This profound and ancient fear, woven into the very fabric of Middle-earth's history, was the reason why Sauron, the Dark Lord, truly feared Aragorn. The legacy of that fear, of that profound recognition of a purity he could not corrupt, lingered in the very air around Mordor, a palpable dread that permeated the hearts of his servants. For Sauron understood, with a chilling clarity, that the ring, his greatest tool of subjugation, could not forever escape the grasp of those who wielded such inherent strength. He had seen it with Isildur, who, for a brief, fleeting moment, resisted the urge to destroy it. But Isildur's strength, though great, was ultimately flawed, tainted by the desire for revenge. Aragorn, however, presented a different kind of challenge. He was a man who, by his very nature, seemed to repel the insidious whispers of the One Ring, a man whose will was forged in the fires of long suffering and noble purpose. Sauron's fear of Aragorn was not born of weakness in himself, but of a deep understanding of the fundamental forces at play in Middle-earth. He knew the prophecies, the ancient foretellings of the return of the king. He knew the lineage, the unbroken line stretching back through millennia to the Dúnedain of the north, to the kings of Númenor, and ultimately to the Eldarion, the house of Elros. This was not merely a man, but the inheritor of a destiny, a living echo of a past Sauron had striven so hard to erase. The very name, Elisar, Elfstone, whispered throughout the lands, carried with it the weight of ancient alliances, of the elves and men bound together in a common cause against the shadow. Consider the events leading up to the War of the Ring, the subtle movements and machinations that Sauron orchestrated. He struck at Gondor, the last bastion of men in the West, because he knew that its strength, though waning, was still a threat. He amassed his armies, bred his orcs, and unleashed his Nazgûl, all in a desperate attempt to overwhelm and crush any lingering resistance before the return of the king could be fully realized. He feared the rekindling of hope, the lighting of beacons that would signal not just a call to arms, but a spiritual awakening in the hearts of men. Aragorn, in his journey from the wilds of the north, through the trials of the Fellowship, and finally to his emergence as the rightful heir, was systematically dismantling Sauron's carefully constructed world of despair and division. The Council of Elrond, though Sauron was not privy to its words, represented a moment of profound unity, a gathering of the free peoples against the encroaching darkness. Aragorn's presence there, his quiet dignity, his claim to the shards of Narsil, all spoke of a destiny that Sauron desperately sought to thwart. His attempts to corrupt Boromir, to twist his heart with the lure of the ring, were aimed at undermining the very foundation of this unity, to sow distrust and ambition where solidarity was most needed. He understood that a united front, led by a righteous king, was the one thing that could truly challenge his dominion. And when Frodo and Sam embarked on their perilous journey into Mordor, it was Aragorn's actions, far away at the Black Gate, that drew Sauron's attention, that diverted his terrible eye from the true threat. This was not merely a tactical maneuver. It was a testament to the immense power of Aragorn's presence, his ability to command such a profound portion of Sauron's focus. The Dark Lord, in his pride and his deeply ingrained misunderstanding of compassion and sacrifice, believed that the greatest threat lay in open warfare, in the clash of armies, in the direct confrontation of power. He could not conceive of the quiet, unwavering courage of a hobbit or the selfless devotion of a companion, but he could recognize the strength of a king, a true leader of men. The fear was not just of Aragorn's physical prowess, though he was a formidable warrior. It was the fear of his moral authority, his inherent goodness, his unwavering commitment to justice and compassion. Sauron, steeped in millennia of malice and corruption, had long forgotten what true virtue looked like. He had seen it in the Valar, in the Eldar of old, and it had always been anathema to him to see it manifested in a mortal man, one who wielded no great magical power, but only the strength of his character and the righteousness of his cause was deeply unsettling. He had always sought to dominate by fear, by despair, by preying on the weaknesses of others. Aragorn offered courage, hope, and strength, and these were weapons Sauron had no defense against. The very act of Aragorn healing the sick and wounded in Minas Tirith after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, through the ancient craft of the kings, was a symbolic blow against Sauron's power. It showed that the king had returned not merely to lead armies, but to heal, to restore, to bring life back to a land ravaged by war and despair. This was a direct refutation of Sauron's philosophy of destruction and subjugation. He sought to diminish, to enslave, to break the spirits of men. Aragorn sought to uplift, to heal, to inspire. These were two utterly opposing forces, and Sauron, in his ancient wisdom, understood the ultimate power of the latter, the enduring myth of the kings of men. The promise of their return had always been a thorn in Sauron's side. He had done everything in his power to sever that lineage, to scatter the Dúnedain, to make their claims seem like a forgotten dream. Yet against all odds, Aragorn had not only survived, but thrived, growing in wisdom and strength in the wild lands, preparing himself for the very moment that Sauron most dreaded. His journey was a testament to the resilience of hope, to the enduring power of ancient bloodlines, and to the unwavering will of those who refuse to surrender to darkness. Sauron's fear of Aragorn was deeply rooted in his past experiences, particularly his encounters with the Númenorians in the Second Age. He had seen their might, their proud ships, their vast armies. He had witnessed their downfall, brought about by his own cunning and their pride. But he had also seen their inherent strength, their capacity for greatness, even in their corruption. Aragorn represented the purest strain of that Númenorian blood, untainted by the hubris that had led to the downfall of his ancestors. He was the potential of what men could be, uncorrupted and noble, and that potential was a far greater threat than any army. Even the manner of Aragorn's rule after the War of the Ring would have filled Sauron with a bitter dread had he retained any conscious thought. For Aragorn, now King Elessar, did not rule with an iron fist, but with wisdom and justice. He rebuilt, he healed, he fostered alliances, and he brought a new era of peace and prosperity to Middle-earth. This was the antithesis of everything Sauron stood for, everything he had ever sought to achieve. The return of the king was not just a military victory. It was a spiritual triumph, a rekindling of the light that Sauron had striven for so long to extinguish. The tale of Aragorn, from his hidden youth as a ranger to his glorious coronation, is a story woven with trials and triumphs, a slow, deliberate unfolding of destiny. Each step he took, each choice he made, was a quiet defiance of Sauron's dominion. His love for Arwen, an elf maiden, was another symbol of this defiance, a bridge between races that Sauron had sought to divide. It spoke of unity, of hope, of a future where peace could truly flourish. Sauron's fear was not merely a transient emotion, but an ancient, ingrained apprehension, a core aspect of his being that recognized the one force he could truly not overcome: pure, unadulterated goodness, embodied in a king who truly cared for his people and for the world. He understood that such a force, when combined with courage, wisdom, and an unwavering will, was an existential threat to his very existence. He had sought to dominate the minds of men, to reduce them to slaves, to break their spirits. But Aragorn, by his very presence, by his very being, shattered that illusion. He showed that men could be noble, courageous, and capable of resisting even the greatest darkness. This deep-seated fear, this profound understanding of the threat that Aragorn represented, was the driving force behind Sauron's desperate, all-consuming push to conquer Middle-earth before the true king could return. He knew that if Aragorn were to claim his birthright, if he were to unite the free peoples and lead them against the Shadow, his millennia-long quest for dominion would be irrevocably doomed. And in the end, that is precisely what came to pass. The courage of a few, led by the wisdom of a king, brought about the downfall of the greatest evil of their age, a testament to the enduring power of hope against the darkest despair, and the profound reason why Sauron, the Dark Lord, truly feared Aragorn. The lingering shadows of Sauron's reign had begun to recede, but the task before Aragorn, now truly Elessar's Telcontar, was immense. The lands were scarred, the hearts of many were weary, and the memory of ancient evils still stirred uneasily in the deep places of the world. Yet, with a quiet strength born of his ancient lineage and his own hard-won wisdom, Aragorn set about the healing of the realm. He did not rush, for he understood that true healing takes time, like the slow mending of a shattered vessel. His first acts were those of restoration and reconciliation. He pardoned many who had served the enemy under duress, understanding that fear had driven their choices, not inherent malice. He sought out the scattered remnants of his people, the Dúnedain, who had long lived in the shadows, their purpose almost forgotten, and he brought them once more into the light. giving them a place of honor and responsibility in the renewed kingdom. They, who had preserved the lineage and the law for so many centuries, were now instrumental in its revival. He travelled extensively across his vast domain, from the distant reaches of the Harad to the troubled lands of the east, bringing justice and establishing order where chaos had long reigned. He did not rule from afar, but walked among his people, listening to their grievances, offering counsel, and sharing in their burdens. This direct, personal connection forged a bond of loyalty that no tyrant could ever command, a bond rooted in respect and genuine affection. One of his most significant deeds was the restoration of the ancient capital of Arnor, Númenor, which had long lain in ruins. This was not merely a construction project, but a symbolic act, a declaration that the glory of the North Kingdom, once thought lost forever, would rise again. The work was slow, painstaking, and required immense resources, but Aragorn saw it through, recognizing its importance as a beacon of hope and a center of learning and governance for the northern territories. He also turned his attention to the land itself, which had suffered grievously under Sauron's corrupting influence. He encouraged the replanting of forests, the cleansing of poisoned waters, and the renewal of fertile fields. His understanding of nature, honed during his years as a ranger, proved invaluable. He brought back the ancient knowledge of husbandry and healing, fostering a deep respect for the natural world that had been eroded by the relentless march of industry and war under the shadow. His alliance with the Elves, though many were now departing Middle-earth, remained strong. Legolas, the elf of the woodland realm, remained in Ithilien for a time, helping to heal and restore the ravaged land, nurturing new forests and bringing beauty back to a place long scarred by war. Gimli, son of Glóin, also journeyed to the glittering caves of Aglarond, bringing skilled dwarven craftsmen to rebuild and beautify the cities of men, especially Minas Tirith, whose ancient stones now shone with renewed splendor. This friendship between dwarf, elf, and man, so vital in the war against Sauron, continued to flourish under Aragorn's reign, a testament to his vision of a united Middle-earth. His marriage to Arwen Undomiel, daughter of Elrond half-elven, was not just a personal joy, but a profound symbolic act. It was the intertwining of the ancient lines of the Eldar and the Edain, a fulfillment of the prophecy that the blood of the two houses, once separated, would be reunited. Arwen, having chosen a mortal life, brought her wisdom, grace, and ancient lore to the court of Gondor, enriching it with the timeless beauty of the Elves. She was a queen, not of earthly pomp, but of quiet dignity and deep understanding, a true partner to Aragorn in the arduous task of rebuilding. The memory of Sauron, however, did not entirely vanish with his defeat. There were still remnants of his evil, cults and dark hearts that whispered of his return, stirring unrest in forgotten corners. Aragorn, ever vigilant, addressed these threats with firmness, but also with a desire to understand and to heal the underlying causes of despair that allowed such darkness to fester. He knew that true peace was not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice and hope for all. He worked closely with the surviving members of the Fellowship and other wise counselors. Gandalf, now Gandalf the White, remained in Middle-earth for a time, offering his unparalleled wisdom and guidance, a steadying hand in the tumultuous years of transition. The friendship between Aragorn and Gandalf deepened, a bond forged in shared peril and mutual respect. a partnership that had guided Middle-earth through its darkest hour and now helped to illuminate its new dawn. The passing of the Elves, however, was a source of quiet sorrow, even in these times of triumph. Aragorn understood that his reign marked the beginning of the Age of Men, and that the ancient, magical beauty of the Eldar was destined to fade from the shores of Middle-earth. He honored their departure, recognizing it as a natural, if poignant, progression of the world. He ensured that the memory of their wisdom and their beauty would be preserved in the lore and the hearts of men. Aragorn's reign was one of peace and prosperity, a golden age for men. He extended the borders of his kingdom not through conquest, but through alliance and shared purpose. He fostered trade and communication between disparate peoples, breaking down the ancient barriers and suspicions that Sauron had so skillfully exploited. He established academies of learning, promoting knowledge and scholarship, for he believed that an enlightened populace was the strongest bulwark against the return of darkness. His wisdom became legendary, his justice unwavering, and his courage an inspiration. He ruled for over a century, a span of life granted to him as a descendant of the Númenorian kings, a gift that allowed him to firmly establish the foundations of the reunited kingdom. During his long reign, the scars of the War of the Ring slowly began to heal, and a new generation grew up knowing only peace, a peace hard-won and diligently maintained. When the time came for him to lay down his life, he did so with the same quiet dignity and foresight that had marked his entire reign. He was the last of the great Númenorian kings to possess such a long life, a final echo of an age of greater majesty. He knew that his passing would be a turning point, signaling the full onset of the Age of Men, a period where mortals would guide their own destinies without the direct intervention of the elder races. He spoke to his son, Eldarion, imparting the wisdom gleaned from a life lived in service to Middle-earth. He charged him with the continuation of peace, justice, and the safeguarding of the realm. He did not fear death, for he had embraced his mortal destiny. He had walked the path chosen by his beloved Arwen, and he knew that, though sorrow would touch them both, their love transcended the boundaries of life and death, just as their union had bridged the ages. Arwen, though she had chosen mortality, found that the fading of the elves and the departure of her kin left her with a profound sense of loss, a sorrow that only truly settled upon her after Aragorn's passing. She had made her choice for love, and she never regretted it, but the weight of the years and the changes in the world bore heavily upon her spirit. She eventually journeyed to Cairn Amroth in Lothlorien, the place where she and Aragorn had plighted their troth, and there she laid down to rest, a final, poignant farewell to a world that was becoming ever more mortal. The legacy of Aragorn, King Elessar, was not merely the defeat of Sauron, but the establishment of a lasting peace, a kingdom founded on principles of justice, compassion, and unity. He had restored the ancient lineage of kings, not as a symbol of oppressive power, but as a shepherd of his people, a protector of the weak and a beacon of hope. His reign stood as a testament to the enduring strength of men when guided by wisdom and courage, a living embodiment of the ideals that Sauron had sought to crush, the fear that Sauron had harbored, that profound apprehension of a true king, a leader of men who could inspire and unite rather than dominate, was ultimately proven to be his undoing. He had understood, perhaps better than anyone, the potential of men, their capacity for both great good and great evil. He had sought to exploit their weaknesses, to turn them into instruments of his will. But Aragorn, by his very existence, by his unwavering commitment to justice and his deep love for Middle-earth, demonstrated the true power of men when they chose the path of light. And so, the tale of why Sauron truly feared Aragorn is not just a story of a single man's triumph over a Dark Lord. It is a profound exploration of the nature of power, the strength of hope, and the enduring struggle between light and shadow. It speaks to the idea that true dominion comes not from force and terror, but from service and love, and that even the greatest evil can be overthrown by the courage of those who choose to stand for what is good. It is a story whispered in the rustling leaves of the newly grown forests, echoed in the songs of a free people, and forever etched into the very soil of Middle-earth, a lullaby of peace after a long, dark night. This understanding of Aragorn as the embodiment of everything Sauron despised and feared was not a sudden revelation for the Dark Lord. It was a slow, creeping dread that had begun centuries before, long before Aragorn himself was even born. Sauron, in his long existence, had witnessed the rise and fall of countless kingdoms and peoples. He had seen the proud Númenorians, once the greatest of men, succumb to pride and fall into ruin. He had seen the fleeting nature of elvish power in Middle-earth, steadily diminishing with each passing age. He understood the cycles of history, the ebb and flow of power, and he believed that all things ultimately tended towards decay, towards the dominance of a single, unyielding will, his own. But there was a seed of something different in the line of Elendil, a lineage that represented a constant, nagging threat to his grand design. This was the line of kings who had refused to bow, who had carried the memory of the ancient alliance between elves and men, and who, even in their diminished state, held the potential for resurgence. Sauron had spent millennia trying to stamp out this spark. He had broken the Númenorians, scattered the remnants of Arnor, and driven the Dúnedain into the shadows, believing he had effectively neutralized this particular danger. He thought he had learned all there was to learn about the weaknesses of men, their susceptibility to ambition, their fear of death, their desire for power. And indeed, he had used these very weaknesses to great effect, twisting their hearts and turning them against each other for centuries. Yet, despite all his efforts, the line endured. It became a whisper, a legend, but it never fully died. And this persistence, this quiet refusal to be extinguished, must have been a constant irritant, a low thrum of unease beneath the surface of his confident malice. He would have known, through his vast networks of spies and the keen insights of his dark arts, that a true heir of Elendil still lived. He might not have known the exact identity of Aragorn for a long time, but the very concept of a rightful king, one who could unite the disparate peoples of men and call upon ancient loyalties, was a profound threat to his carefully constructed order of chaos and servitude. Sauron's fear of Aragorn was intertwined with his fear of the past itself, a past that held memories of his own defeat. He remembered the last alliance of elves and men, how he had been overthrown by the combined strength of Gil-galad and Elendil. He remembered the sting of Isildur's blade severing the ring from his hand, an act that had nearly undone him completely. The very thought of such an alliance reforming, spearheaded by a descendant of Elendil, would have been a nightmare scenario for him. He understood that while he could corrupt and dominate individuals, a unified front especially one led by a figure of legitimate authority and courage, was a force that even his immense power might struggle to overcome. His obsession with the ring was also a key factor in his fear. The One Ring was not merely a weapon of power, it was an extension of his own will, a vessel for his dominion over all life. But it also represented his vulnerability. He knew that if the ring were ever to fall into the hands of one strong enough to master it and wield it against him, particularly one with a claim to kingship and a heart uncorrupted by his influence, then his entire plan could unravel. He believed that no mortal man could truly resist the ring's lure, but a true king, one born to lead and protect, might be able to harness its power for what they perceived as good, thereby challenging his own dark claim to universal dominion. This was a deeper fear than simply losing the ring. It was the fear of his own creation being turned against him, wielded by a just hand. The glimpses he would have gained through his servants, and perhaps even through his own scrying, of Aragorn's character would have only intensified this dread. He would have seen a man who was not driven by greed or a thirst for personal power. He would have seen a leader who inspired loyalty through respect and self-sacrifice, rather than through terror and coercion. This was alien to Sauron's understanding of power. He believed that all beings, ultimately, were motivated by self-interest, and that the only way to truly control them was through fear or through the promise of power. Aragorn's unwavering sense of duty, his deep love for his people and for Middle-earth, and his humility in the face of his own destiny would have been anathema to Sauron, and therefore deeply unsettling. Sauron's confidence was built on the premise that he understood the nature of the world and its inhabitants better than anyone. He saw all as instruments to be used, all peoples as pawns in his grand game. But Aragorn represented a defiance of this cynical worldview. He was a living testament to the enduring goodness and potential for heroism within men, even after long ages of decline and shadow. This was a variable Sauron struggled to calculate, a force he could not easily quantify or corrupt. Therefore, he sought to eliminate it, to snuff out the light of hope before it could ignite a wider rebellion. The War of the Ring, for Sauron, was not just a quest for the ring. It was a final, desperate attempt to crush this lingering threat once and for all. He marshaled his vast armies, unleashed his most terrible creatures, and focused his entire will on destroying the scattered remnants of resistance. He believed that by overwhelming Gondor, by breaking its spirit and extinguishing its last hope of a king, he would finally secure his dominion over Middle-earth. The return of the king, the sight of the standard of Elendil unfurled before the Black Gate, must have sent a chill through his very being, a confirmation of his deepest fears. It was the moment when the past he had tried so desperately to erase, the lineage he had sought to extinguish, rose up in defiance, embodied in a single, formidable man. Even as the ring was destroyed and his power shattered, the underlying fear that Sauron harbored about Aragorn was validated. It was not the strength of armies alone that defeated him, but the courage of a hobbit empowered by the selflessness of his companion, and the hope that Aragorn represented as a true king. Sauron's defeat was not merely a military one, it was a philosophical one. His belief in the ultimate triumph of evil, in the inevitable corruption of all good, was proven false by the enduring spirit of Middle-earth, championed by Aragorn and those who fought alongside him. The shadow of Sauron, even after his final demise, lingered in the memories of those who had lived through the long age of his power. But the light of Aragorn's reign, the peace and restoration he brought, gradually dispelled those shadows. His legacy was the healing of the land, the rebuilding of shattered communities, and the fostering of a new era of cooperation and understanding between different peoples. He lived a long and fruitful life, guiding his kingdom with wisdom and justice, proving that true power lay not in domination, but in service. And so, the tale of why Sauron truly feared Aragorn becomes a profound meditation on the nature of leadership, the resilience of hope, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. It teaches us that even in the darkest of times, a single individual armed with courage, integrity, and a deep love for their world can stand as a bulwark against the greatest darkness. It is a story that echoes through the ages, a testament to the enduring power of a just heart and a noble spirit, forever etched into the lore of Middle-earth, a beacon of light against the encroaching shadows of despair. The very notion of a king who served rather than demanded service, a king who healed rather than destroyed, was the antithesis of everything Sauron believed and embodied. And it was in this antithesis, this profound ideological opposition, that Sauron found his truest and most potent fear. A fear not just of a warrior, but of an ideal of kingship that threatened to unravel his entire dark philosophy of the world. This fear, therefore, was not merely of a skilled swordsman or a brilliant tactician, though Aragorn was both. It was a deeper, more existential dread, touching the very core of Sauron's being and his understanding of power. Sauron, after all, had witnessed the rise and fall of great kingdoms, the corruption of men, the slow fading of the Elves. He had seen the world brought low by strife and greed, and he believed, with a conviction forged in the fires of Morgoth's will, that all sentient beings inherently sought domination, that power was the ultimate goal, and that only through absolute control could order be maintained. He saw himself as the rightful heir to Morgoth's vision, a vision of absolute dominion over all of Arda. But Aragorn, the scion of ancient kings, offered a different vision. He was a king who had walked among his people in disguise, a ranger who knew the paths and perils of the wild, a healer whose touch brought solace. He was a leader who inspired loyalty not through fear, but through love and respect. His rule was not about subjugation, but about restoration. He sought to mend the brokenness of the world, to heal the wounds inflicted by centuries of darkness, and to foster peace among diverse peoples. This was a concept utterly alien and deeply unsettling to Sauron. Sauron himself had once been a being of light, a Maya named Myron, skilled in craftsmanship and order. But his desire for efficiency, for bringing all things to his will to prevent chaos, had led him down a dark path. He had seen the beauty of order, but had come to believe that such order could only be achieved through absolute control, through the crushing of individual will. He had witnessed the chaotic struggles of the First Age, the endless wars, the suffering, and he had concluded that the only way to prevent such calamities was for a single, powerful will to govern all. He saw himself as that will. So, when Aragorn, a mortal man, stood before him, embodying the very essence of selfless leadership, it was a direct challenge to Sauron's fundamental worldview. Aragorn represented the enduring capacity for good in the hearts of men, a capacity Sauron had long dismissed as fleeting and ultimately corruptible. Sauron had spent millennia manipulating men, turning their desires for power and immortality against them, creating a vast empire of fear and obedience. He had seen their weaknesses, their susceptibility to temptation, their fleeting lifespans that made them eager for any promise of extended existence or power. Yet Aragorn, a mortal, chose a different path. He embraced his mortality, understood his role as a steward of Middle-earth, and sought to elevate those around him rather than dominate them. He was a king who could lay aside his crown and pick up a sword to defend his people, or a healing herb to tend to their wounds. He was a living embodiment of the grace and wisdom of the Númenorian kings of old, before their fall, before their pride led them to challenge the Valar and seek immortality by force. He carried the weight of that tarnished heritage, but he chose to redeem it, to reclaim the nobility that had been lost. The very concept of a king who refused to grasp for ultimate power, who understood that true strength lay in humility and service, was anathema to Sauron. It challenged the very foundation of his long-held beliefs, beliefs that had fueled his entire existence for thousands of years. It represented a fundamental flaw in his understanding of the children of Ilúvatar, a persistent, unyielding spark of goodness that he could never truly extinguish, only temporarily suppress. Moreover, Aragorn was of the bloodline of Elros tar Miniatur, the first king of Númenor, who was granted the choice between the doom of men and the life of the Eldar. Elros chose to be counted among men, but his lineage retained a unique purity and wisdom, a connection to the Eldar and the Valar that set them apart. This lineage, though long fragmented and hidden, represented a direct link to the ancient glories of men, to a time when their hearts were less shadowed by the influence of Morgoth and his servant. Sauron, who had directly participated in the corruption and downfall of Númenor, knew the potency of that bloodline. He had meticulously worked to extinguish it, to ensure that no true heir of Isildur would ever rise to challenge his dominion. The return of a king, a true Gondorian king, descended from Elros, was precisely what Sauron had dedicated centuries to preventing. He had seen the power of such kings in the past, their ability to rally peoples, to inspire hope, to wield authority not just through force, but through inherent right and wisdom. He had seen the power of their armies, which had once driven him back to Mordor. The re-establishment of the united kingdom of Arnor and Gondor under an uncorrupted king was the single greatest threat to his aspirations for dominion. It was the antithesis of the fragmentation and weakness he had so carefully cultivated among men. The fear was not sudden. It was a slow, creeping dread that began to solidify as Aragorn's legend grew. At first, he was but a ranger, a rumour, a distant threat. But as the War of the Ring progressed, as Aragorn revealed himself, as he wielded Andúril, the reforged blade of Elendil, and marched to the Black Gate, Sauron's ancient fears were rekindled. He saw in Aragorn the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, the return of a power that he had believed forever broken. The scene at the Black Gate, when Aragorn stood before the hosts of Mordor, challenging Sauron's greatest captain, the mouth of Sauron, was a moment of profound symbolic significance. Here was the king, the true king, confronting the very embodiment of Sauron's twisted power, speaking truth to tyranny. Aragorn's willingness to sacrifice himself and his army, to draw Sauron's attention away from Frodo and Sam, was the ultimate act of selfless kingship, a direct defiance of Sauron's philosophy of self-preservation and domination at all costs. Even if the ring had not been destroyed, Aragorn's defiance, his restoration of the ancient line, had already dealt a critical blow to Sauron's psychological warfare. Sauron thrived on despair, on the belief that all hope was lost, that resistance was futile. But Aragorn, by simply existing and claiming his birthright, offered an alternative, a glimmer of light in the encroaching darkness that Sauron found unbearable. The very name Elisar, the Elfstone given to Aragorn by Galadriel, was a testament to his unique role. It connected him to the ancient elvish wisdom, to the light of the undying lands, and to the healing power of nature that Sauron sought to corrupt and destroy. It signified a king chosen not just by blood, but by destiny and by the highest powers of Middle-earth. So, when Sauron's power finally shattered, it was not just a military defeat, but a profound ideological failure. His belief that evil would inevitably triumph, that all good would eventually be corrupted or fade, was proven utterly false by the enduring spirit of Aragorn and those who fought alongside him. The long defeat, a concept so central to the elves' understanding of their fading presence in Middle-earth, was reversed for men by Aragorn's reign. He ushered in an age of men not defined by their weakness or susceptibility to darkness, but by their capacity for enduring good, for wisdom, and for courageous leadership. The fear of Sauron regarding Aragorn was multifaceted. It was the fear of the return of a powerful lineage he had sought to exterminate, the fear of a king who embodied altruism and service rather than domination, the fear of an ideological antithesis that threatened to unravel his entire dark philosophy, and ultimately the fear of hope itself, a light he could never truly extinguish. In Aragorn, Sauron saw not just an enemy king, but the living refutation of everything he believed and stood for, a testament to the enduring power of a just heart and a noble spirit, forever etched into the lore of Middle-earth, a beacon of light against the encroaching shadows of despair. The memory of Aragorn's true kingship would forever stand as a testament against the lie of Sauron's dominion, ensuring that for long ages the whispers of darkness would be countered by the memory of a king who chose light. This multifaceted dread, this almost existential terror that Sauron harbored for Aragorn, did not spring forth fully formed in the tumultuous days of the War of the Ring. Nay, its roots stretched back into the deep history of Middle-earth, threading through ages of conflict and the slow, grinding erosion of ancient lines. To truly understand why Sauron, the mighty Dark Lord, trembled at the thought of a mere mortal man, we must delve into the very fabric of his being, his history, and his understanding of power. Sauron, originally Myron, a spirit of the Mire, once served Aule the smith, learning much of craftsmanship and order. But his desire for precision, for control, for the swift accomplishment of his designs, led him astray. He fell into the shadow of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, and became his most trusted lieutenant, his greatest servant. From Morgoth, Sauron learned the lessons of domination, of bending wills, of turning creation to destruction. He witnessed the ruin of Beleriand, the might of the Noldor elves, and the eventual triumph of the Valar in the War of Wrath. This cataclysmic event, which sank much of the ancient world beneath the waves, indelibly marked Sauron. He saw Morgoth, his master, defeated and cast into the void, not by his peers among the Valar, but by mortal men, the Dúnedain, aided by elves. This lesson, that even the greatest power could be overthrown by the unexpected courage and unity of lesser beings, particularly men, was one he never forgot. After Morgoth's defeat, Sauron, though outwardly penitent, held fast to his desire for dominion. He disdained the Valar, believing them to be feckless and slow, and resolved to order Middle-earth according to his own will, for its own good, as he saw it. He believed he could achieve this more subtly than Morgoth, not through overt destruction, but through manipulation and control. It was in the Second Age that Sauron truly began to forge his own path to power, and it was here that his burgeoning fear of certain men began to take shape. He presented himself as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, benevolent and wise, and taught the elves of Eregion, particularly the Noldrin smiths led by Celebrimbor, the secrets of ringcraft. His ultimate goal, of course, was to forge the One Ring, a master ring to control all others, to dominate the wills of those who wore them. And indeed, he succeeded, crafting the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom. But the elves, especially Gil-galad and Galadriel, perceived his treachery and hid their rings. It was during this age, too, that Sauron turned his attention to men. Many Easterlings readily fell under his sway, their hearts already inclined to darkness. But there was another lineage of men, those descended from the Edain who had fought against Morgoth, who had been granted the island kingdom of Númenor as a reward for their faithfulness. These Númenorians, the Dúnedain, grew in power and wisdom, sailing the seas, establishing colonies, and far surpassing other men in stature and longevity. They were a formidable force, and for a long time, Sauron dared not challenge them directly. He feared their might, their ships, their advanced weaponry, and above all, their inherent nobility and connection to the Eldar. But as the centuries passed, the shadow fell over Númenor. The Númenorians, envious of the elves' immortality, began to resent the ban of the Valar, which forbade them from sailing to the undying lands. Sauron, ever the opportunist, saw his chance. He allowed himself to be captured by Ar-Pharazôn, the mighty king of Númenor, and brought to the island. Once there, he slowly, subtly corrupted the hearts of the Númenorians, turning them away from the Valar and towards the worship of Morgoth, promising them eternal life if they served the Dark Lord. He became the king's chief advisor, weaving a web of lies and deceit that led to the ultimate downfall of Númenor. He persuaded Ar-Pharazôn to assault Valinor itself, a blasphemous act that brought about the intervention of Ilúvatar, who sank Númenor beneath the waves in a cataclysm even greater than the War of Wrath. Sauron's spirit, discorporated but unable to die, fled back to Middle-earth, bearing the One Ring. But his fair form, his ability to deceive and charm, was lost forever. He was now irrevocably bound to the image of the Dark Lord. More importantly, he witnessed the destruction of the Dúnedain, save for a small remnant who remained faithful to the Valar. Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, who escaped the ruin on 9 ships, carrying with them the Palantiri and a seedling of the White Tree. These were the faithful, the ancestors of Aragorn. Sauron's fear of this lineage was now twofold. Not only had they escaped the doom he had orchestrated, but they carried within them the very essence of what he sought to destroy: faith, resilience, and a connection to ancient wisdom and light. Elendil and his sons established the kingdoms of Arna in the north and Gondor in the south, and for a time they thrived. But Sauron soon rose again, gathering his strength in Mordor, and a great war ensued, the war of the last alliance of elves and men. It was during this war that Isildur, Elendil's son, after his father fell in battle against Sauron, cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand. This was a moment of profound defeat for Sauron, a shattering of his power, and it came at the hands of a mortal man, a Dúnedain. Though Isildur succumbed to the ring's temptation and did not destroy it, the memory of that moment, of being brought low by a man of that kingly line, would forever haunt Sauron. He was defeated, reduced to a mere shadow, his spirit retreating into the east for centuries to slowly, painfully regain its strength. For the next 2,000 years, Sauron remained largely unseen, known as the necromancer in Dol Guldur, while the kingdoms of the Dúnedain slowly faded. Arnor in the north was eventually shattered by the Witch King of Angmar, Sauron's chief servant, and its kings became a hidden line of chieftains. Gondor, though enduring, was weakened by plague, civil strife, and wars with the Easterlings and Corsairs. The line of its kings failed, and it was ruled by stewards. This slow decay, this long defeat of the Dúnedain, must have been immensely satisfying to Sauron. He believed he had succeeded in breaking their spirit, in ensuring that no true king of that ancient lineage would ever again rise to challenge him. The memory of Isildur was a fading echo, a relic of a bygone age, but the Dúnedain, though hidden, never truly died out. The chieftains of the Dúnedain of the north, the rangers, continued to guard the remnants of their people and the borders of Eriador, maintaining their lineage, their traditions, and their hope, however faint. And among them, unbeknownst to Sauron, was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the heir of Isildur and Elendil, raised in Rivendell under the protection of Elrond, hidden from the Dark Lord's eye. Sauron, in his long vigil, his slow return to power, was obsessed with the One Ring. He believed it was the key to his ultimate victory. He sent out his Nazgûl, his most terrifying servants, to scour Middle-earth for it. He knew that with the ring, he would be unstoppable. Without it, his power was incomplete. But as the War of the Ring approached, he began to feel other stirrings, other threats. There were whispers of a renewed strength in the west, of a great healing, of a growing resistance. His fear of Aragorn was not merely a fear of a skilled warrior or a military leader. It was a deeply ingrained, historical fear, a profound psychological aversion to everything Aragorn represented. Sauron had spent millennia trying to dominate, to pollute, to corrupt the hearts of men, particularly the Dúnedain. He had witnessed their strength, their nobility, and their capacity for good, and he had sought to extinguish it utterly. Aragorn, by his very existence, was a direct repudiation of Sauron's philosophy. He was the embodiment of the ancient kingship of men, a lineage Sauron had painstakingly worked to destroy. His return was a sign that Sauron's long efforts had ultimately failed. Aragorn was not merely a king. He was a healer, a protector, a unifier. He healed the sick with the king's healing hands, a gift passed down through his line, a clear sign of his legitimacy and the blessing of the Valar. He united the disparate peoples of Gondor and Rohan, inspiring them with courage and hope. He did not seek power for power's sake, but for the sake of his people, for the restoration of justice and peace. This altruism, this selfless devotion to good, was utterly alien to Sauron, and therefore profoundly unsettling. Sauron understood power only as domination, as the imposition of one's will upon others. He could not comprehend a power that stemmed from service, from love, from sacrifice. Aragorn's leadership was built on these very principles, and it proved to be a far more potent force than any army Sauron could muster. The fear of Aragorn was the fear of the unknown, the fear of a power that defied his understanding. Furthermore, Aragorn's claim to the throne of Gondor, his rallying of the forces of men, threatened to unite Middle-earth against Sauron in a way that had not been seen since the last alliance. Sauron thrived on division, on sowing discord and distrust. A unified realm of men, led by a true king of their ancient line, was the greatest direct threat to his dominion, even more so than the destruction of the ring itself, in some ways. For even if the ring had been destroyed, a broken and leaderless Middle-earth would still be ripe for his eventual return. But a united realm, under a strong, just king, would be a bulwark against darkness for ages to come. The prophecy of the king's return, though perhaps not explicitly known to Sauron in its every detail, would have been an unsettling undercurrent. Sauron, having seen the cycles of rise and fall, would have sensed the turning of the tide, the shifting of fortunes. He would have known that such a king, if he indeed existed and claimed his birthright, would be a formidable foe, imbued with strength and legitimacy that he himself could never truly command. For his rule was based on fear and coercion. Ultimately, Sauron's fear of Aragorn was the fear of his own past mistakes, the fear of the enduring strength of men, the fear of hope itself. He saw in Aragorn the living legacy of Isildur, the spirit of Elendil, the wisdom of Númenor in its glory, and the unwavering light of the faithful. Aragorn was the refutation of Sauron's darkest desires, the living proof that good could not be entirely extinguished, that even after millennia of shadow, the light could return, brighter and stronger than before. It was a fear woven from the deepest threads of Middle-earth's history, culminating in the man who would finally cast down the shadow and usher in a new age. And in the quiet victory of Aragorn's reign, the echoes of that fear, the true terror of the Dark Lord, would resonate for all time.